Chapter 14. Fighting Chance. It will be the greatest campaign any president ever made. Win, lose, or draw, people will know where I stand. Truman to his sister, autumn 1948. 1. The Ferdinand Magellan was the only private railroad car ever fitted out for the exclusive use of the President of the United States. 83 feet in length and painted the standard dark green of the Pullman Company, it had been built originally in 1928 as one of several luxury cars named for famous explorers, Marco Polo, David Livingstone, Robert Peary, then taken over by the government for Franklin Roosevelt's use during wartime in 1942, when it was completely overhauled to become a rolling fortress. The windows were 3-inch bulletproof glass, the entire car sheathed in armor plate, sides, top, bottom, ends, and doors, with the result that it weighed a colossal 142.5 tons, or as much as a locomotive. Special trucks and wheels had to be built to carry the weight. For security reasons during the war, only the word Pullman appeared on the outside, and still in 1948 the only distinguishing exterior features were the presidential seal fixed to the rear platform, and 3 loudspeakers mounted on top of the platform roof. Inside, everything was designed for comfort. At the forward end were galley, pantry, servants' quarters, and an oak-paneled dining room, which doubled as a conference room for the president, this furnished with china cabinets, a mahogany dining table, and 6 matching chairs upholstered in gold and green striped damask. Beyond, down a side aisle, were 4 staterooms marked A, B, C, and D, the 2 middle rooms, B and C, forming the presidential suite with joining bath and shower. Stateroom B for the First Lady was a pale peach color. Stateroom C, the President's room, had blue-green walls and carpet and satin chrome fixtures. Past the staterooms at the rear was the observation lounge with blue and brown chairs and a blue sofa, walls covered with an attractive light brown tufted material resembling leather, blue velvet curtains at the windows and at the door opening onto the rear platform. The carpeting was dark green. The whole car was air-conditioned. To its immense weight underway were added some 6,000 pounds of ice for the cooling system, and each room had a telephone that could be hooked up to a trackside outlet whenever the train was standing at a station. To Truman, who loved trains and loved seeing the country, it was the perfect way to travel, and one he had enjoyed frequently since becoming president. There had been the memorable night of poker with Churchill on the way to Missouri for the Iron Curtain speech, the long, non-political swing west in June. More recently, he had made a quick one-day tour of Michigan for a Labor Day speech at Detroit's Cadillac Square to open his campaign for re-election. Yet for all the miles covered, the days and nights spent on board the Magellan, these prior expeditions had been only prologue to the odyssey that began the morning of Friday, September 17, 1948, when the Magellan, at the end of a 17-car special train, stood waiting on track 15 beneath the cavernous shed of Washington's Union Station. In June he had gone 9,000 miles. Now, on what was to become famous as the Whistle Stop Campaign, he would travel all told 21,928 miles, as far nearly as around the world, as far nearly as the voyage of Magellan. The idea was his own. "I want to see the people," he had said. There would be 3 major tours. First, cross-country to California again for 15 days. Then a 6-day tour of the Middle West, followed by a final hard-hitting 10 days in the big population centers of the Northeast and a return trip home to Missouri. There were no deep-hid schemes, no devious plans, remembered Charlie Ross, nothing that could be called in the language of political analysts high strategy. The president would simply take his case to the country in a grueling no-quarter contest. Mileage meant crowds. According to Ross, it had been Truman's original intention to go into all 48 states, including those of the Deep South. He rather relished the prospect of facing up to the Dixiecrats on their home grounds. How did he expect to be received in the South, Truman was asked. Why, with courtesy, of course, he replied. The idea of a Southern trip held appeal, wrote Ross, because it would show that the boss had courage, but the plan was ultimately ruled out on the ground that every ounce of energy should be used in places where material political gain might be expected. The political courage of the president had already been amply demonstrated. So for a total of 33 days, more than a month, the Magellan was to be center stage for a fast-rolling political roadshow, which, as was said, had but one act, and that one act built around just one performer. "We play more towns than the World of Mirth or Bronx Comedians, and we work longer hours," an accompanying reporter would write. For Truman, away from the White House, the big private car would be home, office, presidential command center, campaign headquarters, and a place where, day after day, he would somehow, bravely, almost inconceivably, keep hope alive. No president in history had ever gone so far in quest of support from the people, or with less cause for the effort, to judge by informed opinion. Nor would any presidential candidate ever again attempt such a campaign by railroad. As a test of his skills and judgment as a professional politician, not to say his stamina and disposition at age 64, it would be like no other experience in his long, often difficult career, as he himself understood perfectly. More than any other event in his public life or in his presidency thus far, it would reveal the kind of man he was. "It's going to be tough on everybody," he told the staff, "but that's the way it's got to be. I know I can take it. I'm only afraid that I'll kill some of my staff. And I like you all very much, and I don't want to do that." The rest of the train was made up of diners, lounges, sleepers, a press car, a dynamo car for power, and a communications car, a converted baggage car operated by the Signal Corps, where radio teletype would provide continuous contact with Washington and thus the rest of the world, a point of critical importance to Truman, who had become more and more uneasy over the situation in Berlin. "I have a terrible feeling that we are very close to war," he had written privately the night of September 13th. Security would be a major undertaking. Every grade crossing would have to be checked in advance by the Secret Service. A pilot train, a single locomotive and one car, would run 5 miles ahead of the president's train to absorb any possible trouble. The railroad official in charge, who had been handling presidential trips since the time of Warren G. Harding, admitted he was a nervous wreck. "Every grade crossing has to be manned when the train passes, and I just can't tell you how many switches have to be spiked until we've moved on," he told a reporter. Once rolling, the train would travel under the code name POTUS, for President of the United States, which gave it the right-of-way everywhere in the country. Truman liked to move fast. Roosevelt, because of his infirmities, had preferred a smooth, easy pace of no more than 35 miles an hour when traveling in the Magellan. Truman liked to go about 80. A cheer went up from the moderate-sized crowd gathered at the Union Station platform, the sound echoing under the vaulted roof as his limousine, easing through a break in the crowd, pulled right to the gate. Truman stepped out looking positively buoyant, Margaret close behind. Marshall and Barclay had come to see him off. The First Lady would catch up with the caravan at Des Moines. Charlie Ross, Clark Clifford, Matt Connolly, George Elsey, Charlie Murphy, White House physician Wallace Graham, and Rose Conway, the president's secretary, were all present and waiting to go on board, in addition to several White House stenographers, Jonathan Daniels, who would help with speeches, and 3 new speechwriters, David M. Noyes, Albert Z. Carr, and John Franklin Carter. Bill Boyle of Kansas City, an old Truman friend and aide who had served on the Truman Committee, would, like Matt Connolly, be handling political chores. Counting the whole staff, the Secret Service detail, 44 reporters and 5 photographers, the complete entourage numbered some 70 people. The one notable absentee was Harry Vaughn, who would remain out of sight and out of contact with the press for the duration of the campaign at Truman's request. With everything ready, Truman and Barclay posed together on the rear platform for a few last pictures. "Mow 'em down, Harry," Barclay exhorted. "I'm going to fight hard. I'm going to give 'em hell," said Truman, setting the theme at the start. The odds against him looked insurmountable. The handicaps of the Truman campaign, wrote columnist Marquis Childs, one of the writers on board, loomed large as the Rocky Mountains. Henry Wallace and the Dixiecrats had split the Democratic Party 3 ways. Conceivably, New York and the South were already lost to Truman. The victory of the Republicans in the elections of 1946 had been resounding, and ever since the Civil War, the party winning the off-year election had always gone on to win the presidency in the next election. At Washington dinner parties, as best Truman had heard, the talk was of who would be in the Dewey cabinet. Some prominent Democrats in Washington were already offering their homes for sale. Even the president's mother-in-law thought Dewey would win. In the West, where Truman had made an all-out effort in June, predictions were that at best he might win 19 of the 71 electoral votes at stake. Only Arizona, with 4 votes, looked safe for Truman, and the West was essential. A Gallup poll of farm voters gave Dewey 48%, Truman 38%, and the farm vote, too, was essential. On September 9th, a full week before Truman's train departed Washington, Elmo Roper, a widely respected sampler of public opinion, had announced his organization would discontinue polling since the outcome was already so obvious. "My whole inclination," Roper said, "is to predict the election of Thomas E. Dewey by a heavy margin and devote my time and efforts to other things." The latest Roper poll showed Dewey leading by an unbeatable 44 to 31%. More important, said Roper, such elections were decided early. Political campaigns are largely ritualistic. All the evidence we have accumulated since 1936 tends to indicate that the man in the lead at the beginning of the campaign is the man who is the winner at the end of it. The winner, it appears, clinches his victory early in the race and before he has uttered a word of campaign oratory. The idea that the campaign was largely ritualistic, a formality only, became commonplace. Life, in its latest issue, carried a picture of Governor Dewey and his staff under the headline, "Albany provides preview of Dewey administration." Yet, inexplicably, Truman had drawn tremendous crowds in Michigan on Labor Day. 100,000 people had filled Cadillac Square. By train and motorcade he rolled through Grand Rapids, Lansing, Hamtramck, Pontiac, and Flint, where to Truman and his staff the crowds were even more impressive. Cadillac Square, that was organized, remembered Mac Connolly. But we rode from there up to Pontiac, and from Detroit to Pontiac I'd see people along the highway. This was not organized, and there were a lot of them out there. According to police estimates, the turnout at Truman's 6 stops in Michigan totaled more than 500,000 people. Often in later years, the big Truman crowds would be remembered as a phenomenon of the final weeks of the campaign. But this was a misconception. They were there from the start, in Michigan and in traditionally Republican Iowa, in Davenport, Iowa City, Grinnell, Des Moines, beginning September 18th, his first full day heading west. Newsmen were nonplussed, reported Time. All across Republican Iowa, large crowds turned out. A good deal of the cheering was enthusiastic. The main event of the day was the national plowing contest at Dexter, 40 miles west of Des Moines, where Truman spoke at noon, in blazing sunshine, standing front and center on a high, broad platform, a sea of faces before him, a giant plowing scoreboard behind. The crowd numbered 90,000. The long horizons were rimmed with ripening corn. The atmosphere was of a vast county fair in good times, with throngs of healthy, well-fed, sun-baked, and obviously prospering people enjoying the day, as dust swirled in a steady wind and more families arrived in new trucks and automobiles. Lined up in an adjoining field, their bright colors gleaming in the sun, were perhaps 50 private airplanes. It was a Republican crowd. Iowa had a Republican governor. All 8 Iowa representatives in Congress and both senators were Republicans. In the last presidential election, Iowa's 10 electoral votes had gone to Dewey. But more important to Truman, nearly all his audience were farmers, and in the Depression, he knew, Iowa farmers had voted for Roosevelt. Years before, in 1934, when he had been running for the Senate the first time, a St. Louis reporter had written, "In a fight, this quiet man can and does hurl devastating fire." Now at Dexter, he ripped into the Republican gluttons of privilege, cold men, cunning men, in a way no one had heard a presidential candidate speak since the days of William Jennings Bryan. The difference between Republicans and Democrats was a difference in attitude. You remember the big boom and the great crash of 1929? You remember that in 1932 the position of the farmer had become so desperate that there was actual violence in many farming communities. You remember that insurance companies and banks took over much of the land of small independent farmers. 223,000 farmers lost their farms. I wonder how many times you have to be hit on the head before you find out who's hitting you. The Democratic Party represents the people. It is pledged to work for agriculture. The Democratic Party puts human rights and human welfare first. These Republican gluttons of privilege are cold men. They are cunning men. They want a return of the Wall Street economic dictatorship. It was language that to many seemed oddly archaic and out of place in the midst of such obvious prosperity. The Des Moines Register would point to the incongruity of being a prophet of doom to an audience in time of harvest of bumper crops. Truman, it was said, was sadly miscast as the new Bryan, his speech harsh and demagogic. But he was leading to something quite specific. In June, when rewriting the charter for the Commodity Credit Corporation, CCC, the Agency for Federal Farm Loans, Congress had included an obscure provision prohibiting the CCC from acquiring additional grain storage bins. It was meant as an economy measure. But since farmers were required to use storage facilities approved or maintained by the CCC in order to qualify for price supports, they stood to lose heavily in the event of wheat and corn crops too large for the existing facilities to handle. If there were no approved bins to store the surplus of a bumper yield, then for the farmers a bumper yield could mean not prosperity, but heavy losses. The bill had gone through unopposed by the Democrats, and Truman had signed it, but that was in June, when no one was paying it much attention. Now the prospect of a bumper year was no longer hypothetical. The corn harvest would not begin until October, but all that day crossing Iowa since early morning, those on board the train had seen little else but corn in abundance. The talk in Iowa was of yields of 135 bushels to the acre. It was the Republican Congress that rewrote the charter for the Commodity Credit Corporation, Truman now charged at Dexter. The Republican Congress, said Truman, had stuck a pitchfork in the farmer's back. Nor would the Republicans stop with limits on grain storage. The whole structure of price supports was in jeopardy. "I'm not asking you to vote for me. Vote for yourselves," he said, a theme he would strike over and over. To reporters covering the event, the huge crowd seemed friendly yet unmoved. But then who was to say? Afterward, in a tent behind the platform, a perspiring president in his shirt-sleeves pulled up a wooden folding chair to a long table with a red check cloth and ate country fried chicken and prize-winning cake and pie with 30 farmers and their wives. Asked if he would please speak again, only on a more personal level this time, Truman agreed and returned to the platform. Was it true he had once been able to plow the straightest furrows in his part of Missouri, he was asked. Yes, said Truman, but only according to an exceedingly partial witness, his mother. But he did have a reputation, he said, for never leaving a skip place when he sowed wheat. My father always used to raise so much fuss about a skip place. He talked of the 12-inch horse-drawn gang plow he rode at Grandview and how it had taken him sometimes 4 days to plow a field. He didn't want to go back to those days. I don't want to turn back the clock. I don't want to go back to the horse and buggy age, although some of our Republican friends do, he said, and this brought a warm cheer. He was delightful, and the people were delighted, wrote Richard Rovere of the New Yorker, who had thought the earlier speech deplorable. Truman had begun the day at 5:45. There had been 6 stops and 6 speeches before Dexter. After Dexter, he spoke at Des Moines, Melcher, and Sheraton, Iowa. At each stop, reported the Des Moines Register, the listeners massed for his rear platform talk were larger than the town's population. You stayed at home in 1946 and you got the 80th Congress, and you got just exactly what you deserved, he said at Sheraton. You didn't exercise your God-given right to control this country. Now you're going to have another chance. He was on a crusade for the welfare of the everyday man, he said next, across the state line, at Trenton, Missouri. At Polo, Missouri, just after 8 p.m., he told the delighted crowd he had not been sure whether he would be able to stop there, but that the railroad had finally consented. It was his 13th speech of the day, and he was sounding a little hoarse. After a brief visit home in Independence the next day, Sunday, September 19th, he was on his way again. Crossing Kansas that night, the engineer had the train up to 105 miles per hour, which Truman, from his chair in the lounge, decided was too fast, considering the weight of the Magellan and what might happen to the forward cars should the engineer suddenly have to stop. Calmly, quietly, he asked Charlie Ross to send word to the engineer that there was no great hurry. 80 miles an hour would do. Understand me when I speak of what the Republicans have been doing. I'm not talking about the average Republican voter, Truman told the 25,000 people spread across the lawn of the state capitol at Denver. Nobody knows better than I that man for man, individually, most Republicans are fine people, but there's a big distinction between the individual Republican voter and the policies of the Republican Party. Something happens to Republican leaders when they get control of the government. Republicans in Washington have a habit of becoming curiously deaf to the voice of the people. They have a hard time hearing what the ordinary people of the country are saying. But they have no trouble at all hearing what Wall Street is saying. They are able to catch the slightest whisper from big business and the special interests. He had just one strategy: attack, 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 carry the fight to the enemy's camp. He hammered the Republicans relentlessly in speeches at Grand Junction, Colorado, Helper, Springville, and Provo, Utah. Selfish men have always tried to skim the cream from our natural resources to satisfy their own greed, and their instrument in this effort has always been the Republican Party, he charged at Salt Lake City to a standing-room-only crowd in the cavernous Mormon Tabernacle. At Ogden, he warned of bloodsuckers who have offices in Wall Street. The 80th Congress, he said at Reno, Nevada, was run by a bunch of old mossbacks still living back in 1890. The country must not go backward, he would keep saying over and over, because he felt with all his heart that Americans were a forward-looking people, and that his own program, as he had told Clark Clifford earlier, was a forward-looking program. If the old guard Republicans were to get control under a Republican administration, they would dismantle the progress made by the New Deal and in foreign affairs, retreat back into isolationism, which would be disastrous for the country and the world. He was certain of this and determined to keep it from happening. To the crowd beside the Southern Pacific tracks at Roseville, California, he declared the Republican do-nothing Congress tried to choke you to death in this valley by cutting off appropriations for publicly owned electric power lines. You have got a terrible congressman here in this district. He is one of the worst, he told the citizens of Fresno, referring to Republican Bertrand W. Gerhardt, who had once denounced George Marshall on the floor of the House. One correspondent, Robert Donovan of the New York Herald Tribune, would later characterize the Truman campaign as sharp speeches fairly criticizing Republican policy and defending New Deal liberalism mixed with sophistry, bunkum piled higher than haystacks, and demagoguery tooting merrily down the track. Truman was at his best speaking to small crowds and without notes, and often, when the subject was himself, his family, his own pioneer background and outlook on life. He was described by some of the Eastern reporters as a feed mill type of talker, and excellent indeed with a small-town crowd. These little speeches, thought Charlie Ross, were more important than the major addresses. They got him close to the people. At both Grand Junction, Colorado, and the Mormon Tabernacle in Salt Lake City, he reminisced about Grandfather Solomon Young and his journeys over the plains, his friendship with Brigham Young. "Oh, I wish my grandfather could see me now," he said spontaneously at Salt Lake, and the audience first laughed, then broke into prolonged applause. "Those pioneers had faith and they had energy," he said, seeming himself to embody an excess of both qualities. Though he refused to put on Indian war bonnets or to kiss babies, he was thankful always for the gifts ceremoniously presented at stop after stop. Hats, spurs, baskets of fruit. "I'll be eating peaches from now until I get to Washington." And nearly always he had something to say about the local scenery, local history, local achievements and interests. "They tell me," he said at Mojave, "that in 1883, that was the year before I was born, that a gentleman by the name of Webb built 10 grand big wagons here in this town, bought himself 100 head of mules, and began to haul borax out of the Mojave Desert. And that was the origin of 20 mule-team borax, which we always kept in the house when I was a kid. I never thought I would be here as president at the place where it originated and talking to you people about your interests in the welfare of the country." He expressed love of home, love of the land, the virtues and old verities of small-town America, his America. "Naturally, if we don't think our hometown is the greatest in the world, we are not very loyal citizens. We all should feel that way," he told the loyal citizens of American Fork, Utah. "You don't get any double talk from me," he declared from a brightly decorated bandstand first thing in the morning sunshine at Sparks, Nevada. "I'm either for something or against it, and you know it. You know what I stand for." What he stood for, he said again and again, was a government of and for the people, not the special interests. He was friendly, cheerful, and full of fight. "You are the government," he said time after time. "Practical politics is government. Government starts from the grassroots. I think the government belongs to you and me as private citizens. I'm calling this trip a crusade. It's a crusade of the people against the special interests, and if you back me up, we're going to win. The basic issue of this campaign is as simple as can be. It's the special interests against the people. I'm here on a serious mission, and because it is so serious, I propose to speak to you as plainly as I can. In 1946, 2/3 of you stayed home and didn't vote. You wanted a change? Well, you got it. You got the change. You got just exactly what you deserved. Now use your judgment. Keep the people in control of the government. I not only want you to vote for me, but I want you to vote for yourselves, and if you vote for yourselves, you'll vote for the Democratic ticket." The crowds would be gathered at station stops often from early morning, waiting for him to arrive. Men and boys perched on rooftops and nearby signal towers for a better view. There would be a high school band standing by, ready to play the national anthem, or Hail to the Chief, or to struggle through the Missouri Waltz, a song Truman particularly disliked, but that it was his fate to hear repeated hundreds of times over. His train would ease into the station as the band blared. The crowd cheered. Then, accompanied by 3 or 4 local politicians, usually a candidate for Congress or state party chairman who had boarded the train at a prior stop, Truman would step from behind the blue velvet curtain onto the platform, and the crowd, large or small, would cheer even more. One of the local politicians would then introduce the President of the United States, and the crowd would cheer again. At the 10-minute stops, he would speak for 5 minutes, beginning with praise for the local candidate for Congress or some issue of local interest, then moving quickly from the general to the particular. He would lambaste the Republican Congress for the high cost of living or failing to vote the grain storage bins, for the Taft-Hartley Act or the rich man's tax bill, for slashing federal support for irrigation and hydroelectric power projects in the West. It was the Republicans in Congress who were holding back progress in the Central Valley of California. Republicans at heart had no real interest in the West, not in water, not in public power. The Republicans who controlled the appropriations committees in the House and Senate, those upon whom the future of federal projects in the Central Valley depended, were not Californians. They were not Westerners. They are Eastern Republicans. "Give 'em hell, Harry," someone would shout from the crowd, news accounts of his promise to Barclay to give him hell having swept the country by now. The cry went up at one stop after another, often more than once. "Give 'em hell, Harry," which always brought more whoops, laughter, and yells of approval, but especially when he tore into the 80th Congress. "I never gave anybody hell," he would later say. "I just told the truth, and they thought it was hell." At the close, he would ask if they would like to meet his family, and the crowd never failed in its response. The routine became standard. He would first introduce Bess, Ms. Truman, who would step out from behind the blue curtain, looking pleased and motherly. He would take her hand, and she would stand at his right, saying nothing. If the crowd was small and especially friendly, he would refer to her as the boss. Then proudly he would present Miss Margaret, whose appearance nearly always brought the biggest cheer of all, and to the obvious delight of her father. She would be carrying an armful of roses, a few of which she would throw to the crowd. Truman would lean over the brass rail to grasp 1 or 2 outstretched hands. Someone would signal the local band to start playing again, and with warning toots of the whistle, with reporters scrambling to get back on board, the crowd cheering, and the 3 Trumans waving, the train would pull slowly out of the station. No matter what the outcome of the campaign, wrote Richard Rovere, millions of Americans would remember for the rest of their lives this final tableau of the 3 traveling Trumans. It will be a picture to cherish, and it will stand Harry Truman in good stead for the rest of his life. Traveling with him, you get the feeling that the American people who have seen him and heard him at his best would be willing to give him just about anything he wants, except the presidency. It could be said also that they had seen and heard for themselves a president who was friendly and undisguised, loyal to his party, fond of his family, a man who cared about the country and about them, who believed the business of government was their business, and who didn't whine when he was in trouble but kept bravely, doggedly plugging away, doing his best, his duty as he saw it, and who was glad to be among them. He wasn't a hero or an original thinker. His beliefs were their beliefs. Their way of talking was his way of talking. He was on their side. He was one of them. If he stumbled over a phrase or a name, he would grin and try again, and they would smile with him. "There is an agreeable warm-heartedness and simplicity about Truman that is genuine," wrote Richard Strout for his column in the New Republic. A presidential train was probably the worst of all places to gauge public opinion, he added. Nevertheless, reporters keep pinching themselves at the size of the crowds and their cordial response. At Los Angeles, at Gilmore Stadium, with screen stars Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart, and Ronald Reagan, all ardent liberal Democrats, seated prominently on stage beside him, Truman hit hard at Henry Wallace, warning liberal Democrats to think again if they thought a vote for the third party was a vote for peace. With communists guiding and using it, the third party did not represent American ideals. A vote for Wallace only played into the hands of the Republican forces of reaction. Now was the hour for the liberal forces of America to unite. Think again. Don't waste your vote. At San Diego, 10,000 turned out, despite threatening skies and the early hour of 9 a.m., and gave him the most enthusiastic welcome thus far. After the stop at Oceanside, California, where the train pulled within sight of the rolling surf of the Pacific, the route was east again. By then, Friday, September 24th, he had been on the road a week, and while some on board had already begun to show signs of strain, Truman, who bore much the heaviest burden, remained steady as a rock. Nor had he left the duties and concerns of the Oval Office. A White House pouch arrived daily, papers requiring his signature, letters to be signed, letters to be read, Reports from department heads, reports to Congress, sealed manila envelopes marked confidential, as well as copies of the Kansas City Star and the Independence Examiner. A memorandum from head usher Howell Krim reported on the quantity of plaster descending in the East Room. The Berlin crisis and the risks involved in the airlift weighed heavily on Truman. Though the quantity of supplies being flown into the city had increased since August, the disturbing truth was that the airlift was supplying less than half of what Berlin needed. "We are not quite holding our own," General Clay had cabled. In another few days in Dallas, at Truman's request, General Walter Beadle Smith, the American ambassador to Moscow, would come quietly aboard the train to give his assessment to Truman of Stalin's mood and the chances of war. Staff work on board had acquired a pattern of a kind, though little about it was systematic or efficient or ever very formal. Of the major speeches, only the one at Dexter, Iowa, had been prepared well in advance. The rest, for Denver, Salt Lake City, Los Angeles, were produced underway, with the combined efforts of Ross, Clifford, Elsie, Murphy, and the new writers Noyes, Carr, and Carter. No speech was ever the work of one writer, and no speech failed to go through several drafts. Truman himself went over every line, worked painstakingly on every draft, and was the first to approve suggested deletions. "That's good," he would say. "Never use two words when one will do best." Convoluted structure and high-blown or evasive phrases greatly annoyed him. "That's not the way I would say it," he would remark as the group sat around the mahogany table in the dining room of the Magellan, working late into the night. "Let's just say what we mean." Nobody had any special pride of authorship, but we did get into heated arguments now and then, wrote Ross. The president would grin and say, "All right, you fellas fight it out, now decide." Ross wanted Truman to ease up on the abusive language and state his case in more dignified fashion. But Truman was determined to keep the heat on. He had also introduced a new line about the housing shortage that made the others wince. If they went to the polls and did their duty on November 2nd, Truman would tell the crowd with a smile, then he wouldn't have to go hunting around in this housing shortage. He could stay right in the White House. It was a line he liked and that he was sure the people liked, so he kept it. Background material, particularly material useful for the rear platform appearances, was provided by a research division of the Democratic National Committee, 3 or 4 bright young men who had been holed up in a small office off DuPont Circle in Washington, and who, according to George Elsie, worked like dogs and ground out an incredible amount of material. All kinds of historical, literary, political, and economic data flowed through them, and news clippings, photostats of useful documents, anything that would give spark and vitality and originality and vigor to President Truman's campaign effort. Elsie's task was to sort and edit it all, then keep the president supplied with pertinent items to choose from, and in proper order as they sped along. I was the whistle-stopper on the job doing the outlines, getting the stuff together, and feeding these back to him, he remembered. I felt I got 25 years' exercise walking from my car to his car in the weeks of the campaign. Bill Boyle would be credited with planning every inch of Truman's itinerary. Constantly in touch with state party leaders, he advised Truman on which towns mattered and why. Traveling ahead of the train, as advance men, were Oscar Chapman, the Undersecretary of Interior, and Donald Dawson of the White House staff. They were responsible for all the details of local ceremonies, to make sure the local politicians knew where and when to come on board Truman's train, and that no such fiasco as the empty hall at Omaha in June ever happened again. Between stops, in the comparative quiet and privacy of the Magellan, the candidate himself remained even-tempered and steadfastly confident. The strain on him was unrelenting, yet he showed no signs of wear and tear or faltering expectations. He knew he was behind, and in private said so, but he was also sure he would catch up and move ahead by November when it would count, a view shared by almost no one else on board, though few other than the press ever talked about it. Once, late in an especially long day, a noticeably weary First Lady asked Clark Clifford if he thought the president really believed he could win, and Clifford said yes. "He gives every appearance under every condition," Clifford answered. "Oh," she said, "I don't know where it comes from." Though several of his staff were gravely concerned about the split in the Democratic ranks, the campaigns underway by the Progressives and the Dixiecrats, Truman seems never to have taken the candidacies of Wallace and Thurmond as serious threats. Henry Wallace was running hard. In August he had bravely campaigned through the South, decrying segregation and refusing to stay in hotels that enforced discrimination. In North Carolina, angry crowds pelted him with eggs and rotten tomatoes. traveling the rest of the country mainly by plane, he would eventually roll up more mileage even than Truman, his main theme remaining constant throughout. The Progressive Party was the peace party that could end the Cold War through direct negotiations with the Soviet Union. At Los Angeles, speaking at the same stadium where Truman had, Wallace drew a larger crowd than Truman had, and it was a paying crowd. But attendance overall at Wallace rallies and speeches was falling off, the excitement of his progressive crusade plainly in decline, as he was perceived and portrayed more and more in the press as playing Moscow's game. Of the Republicans and Democrats, he said they were equally sinister in their policies, both being in the grip of Wall Street and the Pentagon. Strom Thurmond kept harping on states' rights and demanding that the evil forces in control of the Democratic Party be cast out. He called Truman's Fair Employment Practices Committee communistic. Racial integration of the armed services was un-American. The South must hold the line. There's not enough troops in the Army to break down segregation and admit the Negro into our homes, our eating places, our swimming pools, and our theaters. He and the Dixiecrats would win 140 electoral votes in the South, Thurmond said, more than sufficient to force the election into the House. But almost no one took the claim seriously, and Truman least of all. In his speeches, Truman never mentioned Wallace or Thurmond by name, but then never in the major addresses or in any of his largely extemporaneous remarks to small crowds in out-of-the-way places did he speak of Dewey by name. Dewey was always my Republican opponent or the other fellow. He never criticized or ridiculed Dewey in a personal way. Interestingly, Dewey was never even a subject of discussion on board the Ferdinand Magellan. There was no talk of Dewey's personality or failings, no gossiping about him, or even any consideration of attacking him on personal grounds. It would not be recalled that the President ever even mentioned Dewey. 2. Governor Thomas E. Dewey had gone aboard his own campaign train at Albany on Sunday, September 19th, 2 days after Truman left Washington, and Dewey, too, delivered his first major speech in Iowa at Des Moines on Monday the 20th, 2 days after Truman spoke at the Dexter plowing contest. Starting later than Truman, Dewey would travel nowhere near so far and at a much more leisurely pace, and he would deliver far fewer speeches. All this, like everything about the Dewey campaign, having been carefully thought out in advance. As the candidate and his advisers proudly informed the press, nothing was to be left to chance. Press coverage of Dewey's advance across the country was also to be far greater than that Truman received. There were 92 reporters writing the Dewey Victory Special, 98 by the time the train reached California, roughly twice the number traveling with the President, and they were catered to, their everyday needs handled with a skill and efficiency unknown on the Truman train. Copies of the candidates' speeches were nearly always available 24 hours in advance, as they seldom ever were on the Truman train. An internal public address system fed Dewey's remarks directly to the press car and dining cars, so reporters need not bother leaving their air-conditioned comforts. Coffee and sandwiches were provided to reporters at odd hours, their laundry attended to, their luggage moved from train to hotel for overnight stops. To those who had traveled with both candidates, the Truman operation, by comparison, was 40 years behind the times. If you wanted anything laundered on the Truman train, you did it yourself in a Pullman basin, Richard Rovere informed his readers in the New Yorker. When you detrained anywhere for an overnight stay, it was every man for himself. You carried your duffel and scrambled for your food. If a man was such a slave to duty that he felt obliged to hear what the President said in his back-platform addresses, he had to climb down off the train, run to the rear end, mingle with the crowd, and listen. Often this was a hazardous undertaking, for the President was given to speaking late at night to crowds precariously assembled on sections of roadbed built up 15 or 20 feet above the surrounding land. The natives knew the contours of the ground, but the reporters did not, and more than one of them tumbled down a cindery embankment. A condescending tone entered into a lot of what was written about Truman and his efforts. His whole campaign, as Jonathan Daniels said, was given a sort of rube reputation by the largely Eastern press traveling with him. The Dewey campaign, by contrast, was described as slick, tidy as a pin, everything handled with junior executive briskness. The favorite drink on board the Dewey Victory Special was the martini, not bourbon as on the Truman train. The favorite game was bridge, not poker. Dewey himself was cool, careful, supremely self-confident, and from the start elevated in tone. "Tonight we enter upon a campaign to unite America," he told the crowd at Des Moines, where reportedly he was leading Truman by a resounding 51 to 37%. "We propose to install in Washington," Dewey said, an administration which has faith in the American people, a warm understanding of their needs and the competence to meet them. We will rediscover the essential unity of our people and the spiritual strength which makes our country great. We will begin to move forward again, shoulder to shoulder. There were no harsh or divisive accusations, no pitting of farmers against Wall Street, no pitchforks in the back or angry staccato assaults on any segment of government or society. A Republican congressman from Minnesota, August H. Anderson, had written to warn Dewey of discontent among farmers, saying, "We cannot win without the farm vote." But Dewey refrained also from any mention of farm problems. His voice was deep and resonant, as flowing as the smoothest radio preacher. Everything Truman's voice was not. Dewey was dignified. He spoke ill of no one, offended no one. He had no surprises, he took no risks. And the pattern prevailed, his text seldom more rousing than a civics primer. Government must help industry, and industry must cooperate with government, he would say with a grand, preacher-like sweep of the right arm. America's future is still ahead of us, he also said. They were not speeches of the kind he had given in 1944, when he had hit hard and often, charging Franklin Roosevelt with a failure to end the Depression, failure to build American defenses before Pearl Harbor. At one point he had called Roosevelt truly the indispensable man. Indispensable to the ill-assorted, power-hungry conglomeration of city bosses, communists, and career bureaucrats which now compose the New Deal. But there would be no such harangue this time, because this time Dewey was not the challenger. This time he had the election sewed up. It was an odd reversal of roles, with the incumbent president running as the challenger and his opponent performing as though he were already elected and the campaign a mere formality. Dewey had only to mark time, be careful, make no mistakes, say or do nothing silly or improper, and the presidency was his. So the speeches were kept unceasingly positive. He was for unity, for peace, for constructive change. He was not running against the New Deal. He was not even running against Harry Truman, whom he never mentioned, any more than Truman spoke of him, which was another odd turn. Governor Dewey is deliberately avoiding any sharp controversy with the Democratic incumbent, reported the New York Times, as the victory special rolled through California, passing, at one point, within only a few miles of the Truman train. In some ways, the two candidates were much alike. Both were efficient with their time, alert, and energetic. They always looked spanking clean and pressed. Both were men of medium stature, though Truman, the one so often referred to disparagingly as the little man, was an inch taller than Dewey, who was 5 feet 8 inches. And unlike Truman, Dewey was extremely sensitive about his height. They were each diligent career public servants who genuinely believed that good government was possible and the best politics. They both loved music. Truman had dreamed of being a concert pianist, Dewey of being a concert singer, and still loved to sing, especially Oklahoma in the bathtub. Each was devoted to his family. Dewey's wife, Frances, a particularly photogenic woman with a somewhat shy but winsome manner, was generally seen as an asset to his political career, and they had 2 teenage sons, Tom Jr. and John. Like Truman, Dewey was a product of small-town Middle America. He had grown up in Owasso, Michigan, where his father, the editor of the local newspaper, was vitally interested in politics, just as John Truman had been. Beyond there, however, the similarities ended. Where Truman was at heart a 19th-century man, raised, educated, formed in thought and outlook in the era before World War I, Dewey was of a different generation. Dewey had never lived with the burden of farm debt. He had never been to war. He had never been bankrupt. Born in 1902, 18 years after Truman, he was the first candidate for president born in the 20th century. His Middle American origins, moreover, were hardly apparent any longer. Educated at the University of Michigan and the Columbia Law School in New York, he had made his entire career in the East, and with his Homburg hats and cultivated voice, he had left Owasso far behind. Where Truman had been, as Nellie Noland said, a late bloomer all along, attaining prominence only past the age of 50, Dewey had soared almost from the start, achieving national fame as the crusading district attorney of New York while still in his 30s. He was the gangbuster, a national hero. In 1938, at age 36, he had made his first run for governor of New York. Trying again in 1942, he became New York's first Republican governor in 20 years. Running for a second term in 1946, he rolled up the biggest victory in the state's history, winning by nearly 700,000 votes. As governor, he cut taxes, doubled state aid to education, raised salaries for state employees, reduced the state's overall indebtedness by over $100 million, and put through the first state law in the country prohibiting racial discrimination in employment. If elected now, he would be at 46, the youngest president since Theodore Roosevelt. Given his youth, ambition, his proven ability, it was not inconceivable that Thomas E. Dewey could serve as long as or longer than Franklin Roosevelt. If he were to have 4 full terms, he would be in the White House until 1965, and even then would still be younger than was Truman in 1948. But as often noted, Dewey was also extremely cautious and cold in manner, at least in public, which for a politician was what mattered. On the campaign trail, he seemed not to care for the gifts he was offered or to mix with the crowd. He was incapable of unbending. Where Truman, at the end of a platform talk, would ask, "Would you like to meet my family?" Dewey would say stiffly, "I'm pleased to present Mrs. Dewey." "Smile, Governor," a photographer had called at a campaign stop in 1944. "I thought I was," said Dewey. A remark attributed to the wife of a New York Republican politician would be widely repeated. "You have to know Mr. Dewey well," she said, "in order to dislike him." He was so self-controlled as to seem mechanical. Dewey came on stage, wrote Richard Rovere, like a man who has been mounted on casters and given a tremendous shove from behind. And there was a hard look in the dark eyes, a look that had served him well as a prosecutor. "Those eyes tell you this guy doesn't crap around," a staff man once said. It was Dewey's small, dark, bottle-brush mustache that the public knew him best for, and that many people disliked, or wished he would get rid of, mustaches having been long out of fashion among public men. He had grown it on a bicycle tour of France years earlier, and kept it because his wife approved. To the actress Ethel Barrymore, the mustache and Dewey's diminutive size made him look like the bridegroom on the wedding cake, a remark greatly amplified by the acerbic, much-quoted daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, and that may have done Dewey real harm in the campaign. To the reporters on board his train, he seemed aloof, even haughty. They were kept at a distance, and though they were certain he would win, and most believed he would make an efficient chief executive, almost none of them liked him, which was quite the reverse of how they felt about Truman. Dewey's mechanical smile and his bland refusal to deal with issues have got under everybody's skin, wrote Richard Strout of the Mood in the press car. Dewey, it was cracked, was the only man who could strut sitting down. In sharp contrast to Truman, who had never wanted to be president, Dewey had started running for the job as early as 1939, in advance of the Republican convention that nominated Wendell Willkie. Dewey believed it was his destiny to be president. "It is written in the stars," he said privately. That it was written in the polls as well also carried enormous weight with him, for, unlike Truman, Dewey took such samplings with utmost seriousness. He was the first presidential candidate to have his own polling unit. On several major issues, Dewey, as a liberal Republican, held the same or very similar views as Truman. Dewey backed aid to Greece. He supported the Marshall Plan. He believed in a strong military defense, including universal military training. He was for recognition of Israel. He supported the Berlin airlift and wanted further progress made in civil rights. As he and his advisers saw things, the real struggle waited beyond November, not with the Democrats in Congress, but with Taft, whom Dewey intensely disliked. On more than one occasion, Dewey had been heard to say that the Ohio senator should have carnal relations with himself. The dominating strategy of the Dewey campaign, to say as little as possible, was Dewey's own. "When you're leading, don't talk," he would tell the Republican politicians who came aboard his train. The Dewey High Command, however, had more influence than did the people around Truman. They included campaign manager Herbert Brownell, Jr., whose headquarters were in Washington, but who talked to Dewey every night by phone, Paul Lockwood, Dewey's veteran executive assistant, and Elliott Bell, an old friend who wrote speeches and served as unofficial chief of staff on the train. These were able, experienced men. Brownell had been Dewey's campaign manager the last time, as well as chairman of the Republican Party. Lockwood had been with Dewey since his days as district attorney. Elliott Bell, a former financial writer for the New York Times, had managed Dewey's 2 triumphant campaigns for governor. And they all agreed the campaign was going fine. Nor had other Republican politicians objected thus far. "We always asked them what our strategy should be," remembered Bell, "and they all said that as matters stood, Dewey was in, and the thing to do was not stir up too much controversy and run the risk of losing votes." The consensus was that Dewey would have done better in 1944 had he not gone on the attack as he did, so why repeat the mistake? The tone of his campaign was set, wrote Time approvingly, Time, like its sister publication Life, having concluded that Dewey was as good as elected. The real concern among the Dewey staff, reported Time, was over what Truman might do between now and January to upset things, and particularly in the field of foreign policy. The responsibilities of power already weighed on them so heavily that a newsman inquired blandly, "How long is Dewey going to tolerate Truman's interference in the government?" Dewey said life would keep his composure no matter how much his rival taunted, teased, and dared him to come out in the alley and scrap. Dewey himself remarked that he would never get down in the gutter with Truman. He would have preferred a more worthy opponent. In the seclusion of his private car, Dewey wondered aloud, "Isn't it harder in politics to defeat a fool, say, than an abler man?" To help guarantee a Dewey victory, J. Edgar Hoover was secretly supplying him with all the information the FBI could provide. Dewey and Hoover were old friends and got along well. Hoover had put the resources of the Bureau at Dewey's disposal months before, in the expectation that when Dewey became president, he would name Hoover as his Attorney General. The FBI helped Dewey during the campaign itself by giving him everything we had that could hurt Truman, though there wasn't much, remembered an assistant to Hoover, William C. Sullivan, who was one of those assigned to cull the files. We resurrected the president's former association with Jim Pendergast and tried to create the impression that Truman was too ignorant to deal with the emerging communist threat. We even prepared studies for Dewey which were released under his name, as if he and his staff had done the work. No one in the Bureau gave Truman any chance of winning. Only on the issue of communists in government was Dewey willing to taunt Truman. "I suggest you elect an administration that simply won't appoint them in the first place," Dewey said at one stop after another, the line always drawing applause. In Los Angeles, at the Hollywood Bowl, flanked on stage by Republican movie stars, Gary Cooper, Jeanette MacDonald, and Ginger Rogers, who came from Independence, Missouri, Dewey described communism on the march. "The tragic fact is that too often our own government seems so far to have lost faith in our system of free opportunity as to encourage this communist advance, not hinder it. Communists and fellow travelers have risen to positions of trust in our government, and yet the head of our own government called the exposure of communists in our government a red herring." Dewey did not try to inflame crowd passions. He opposed outlawing communists. "We'll have no thought police," he said. Still, the charge that the government was coddling communists, a charge that had been injected into the campaign by the House Un-American Activities Committee, would be made again and again at nearly every stop. Joseph Alsop described the typical Dewey speech as over-rehearsed and a trifle chilling. Marquis Childs warned in his column that in the very expertness of his campaign, Dewey might be laying up future trouble for himself. Privately, among the Dewey people, there was an increasing uneasiness over the size of the crowds, which, as time conceded, were good, but no more than good. At Salt Lake City, Dewey, like Truman, filled the Mormon Tabernacle to overflowing, but the turnout along the streets had been nothing like that for Truman. "We hit Salt Lake City about 5 p.m., Elliott Bell would recall. "I was struck by the fact that there were very few people on the sidewalks, and a good many people walking hardly bothered to look at the motorcade. Then we went into Texas, and everybody said Texas was going to be cold to the president," Truman would later tell a crowd in Neosho, Missouri, recounting his latest adventures. "And the first city we stopped in was El Paso, and everybody in El Paso was down at the station. The chief of police said he estimated the crowd at 25,000. Then we went over and had breakfast with John Garner, former vice president, a good friend of mine, and he gave me a breakfast to write home about. We had chicken and white-winged dove, and we had ham and bacon and scrambled eggs and hot biscuits, and I don't know what all. And the governor of Texas met me there, as did Sam Rayburn, and we went across Texas, and I must have seen 1 million people in Texas." Pounding his way across Texas, Truman had seemed to gather strength by the hour and give more of himself to the campaign with every stop. He was fighting for his political life and having a grand time at it. "He is good on the back of a train because he is one of the folks," said Sam Rayburn. "He smiles with them and not at them, laughs with them and not at them." With the rest of the Old South in revolt over his stand on civil rights, Truman had to hold on to Texas and its 23 electoral votes. Yet racial bias ran strong in Texas. Segregation, poll taxes, outright race hatred. In Texas, he was in Dixiecrat territory for the first time, which was why a cold reception had been assumed. There had even been rumors of threats on his life, of Dixiecrats claiming they'd shoot Truman, that no-good son of a bitch, and his civil rights. It was the first time a Democratic nominee for the presidency had ever found it necessary to court Texas. And banking on friendships with such long-standing, powerful Democrats as Rayburn and Garner, Truman had decided to make it the most strenuous campaign ever waged there by a non-Texan. A high point was the breakfast put on by Cactus Jack Garner at Uvalde, which, reporters discovered to their surprise, was a tree-shaded town with neat green lawns and no sign of anything remotely like cactus. Served on the glass-enclosed porch of Garner's big buff-colored brick house, the breakfast was the best he had had in 40 years, Truman later told the delighted crowd outside. 10,000 people and a high school band had been at Uvalde Station to greet him at 6:50 that morning. Now several thousand cheered as he stood on the front porch with Garner, Rayburn, and Governor Buford Jester, none of whom was known for his devotion to civil rights. Jester, not long before, had called Truman's civil rights program a stab in the back. John Garner and he had been friends a long, long time, and they were going to be friends as long as they lived, Truman said. "I'm coming back for another visit sometime. I fished around for another invitation and got it." Old friendships, old loyalties would hold, in other words, not only now for the sake of politics, but later too, whatever changes were in the wind. The crowd understood what he meant, and the crowd applauded. So pleased was Bess Truman by the warmth of the reception that she broke precedent and stepped forward to the microphone to say thank you, proving thereby beyond all doubt, reported Robert Donovan in the New York Herald-Tribune, what an extraordinary occasion it was. At San Antonio, later the same day, Sunday, September 26th, an estimated 200,000 people filled the streets. And at a dinner that night at the Gunter Hotel, speaking spontaneously and simply of his feeling for people and his wish for peace, Truman achieved what Jonathan Daniels called an eloquence close to presidential poetry. "Our government is made up of the people. You are the government. I am only your hired servant. I am the chief executive of the greatest nation in the world, the highest honor that can ever come to a man on earth. But I am the servant of the people of the United States. They are not my servants. I can't order you around or send you to labor camps or have your heads cut off if you don't agree with me politically. We don't believe in that. I believe that if we ourselves try to live as we should, and if we continue to work for peace in this world, and as the old Puritan said, keep your bullets bright and your powder dry, eventually we will get peace in this world, because that is the only way we can survive with the modern inventions under which we live. We have got to harness these inventions for the welfare of man instead of his destruction. That is what I am interested in. That is what I am working for. That is much more important than whether I am President of the United States." "Truman gains Texas votes by human touch method," read the headline in the San Antonio Express. When a reporter for the Express polled the correspondents on board the train, he found nearly all now thought Truman had at least a fighting chance. In not quite 4 days in Texas, he made 24 stops, spoke 25 times. He had perfect weather and enthusiastic crowds the whole way. Monday, September 27th, the biggest day, began with a rear platform talk at San Marcos at 6:40 in the morning. As the day wore on, he spoke at Austin, Georgetown, Temple, Waco, Hillsboro, Fort Worth, Grand Prairie, Dallas, Greenville, and the little rail stop of Bells, where he told the crowd, "I'm going over to Bonham and make the speech. It's only 12 miles. Why don't you just get in the car and come on over to Bonham, and I will give the Republicans the gun over there. I think you will like it." The Bonham speech, last of the day, was carried by radio nationwide. On board with him through the day were Rayburn, Governor Jester, and Congressman Lyndon Johnson, candidate for the Senate, who had just been certified by the Democratic State Convention as having defeated his rival in the primary, former Governor Coke Stevenson, by a total of 87 votes out of roughly 1 million cast. At Waco, a boy waved a Confederate flag, and there were scattered boos from the crowd when Truman shook hands with a black woman. Otherwise, all was harmonious, but then neither did he mention civil rights. At Rebel Stadium in Dallas, where authorities quietly did away with segregation for the day and blacks and whites were mingled in the cheering crowd as never before, Truman, for the first time, hit hard at Republicans for the hypocrisy of their high-level campaign, the Dewey speeches. So in making their speeches, they put them on a very high level, so high they are above discussing the specific and serious problems which confront the people. Republican candidates are apparently trying to sing the American voters to sleep with a lullaby about unity. They want the kind of unity that benefits the National Association of Manufacturers, the real estate trusts, the selfish interests. They don't want unity, they want surrender. And I am here to tell you people that I will not surrender. Bonham, in the fertile Blackland Prairie, was Sam Rayburn's hometown, And at Bonham, Truman went after Dewey again, saying Republican unity meant unity of the Tafts and the Martins of Congress. Unity in giving tax relief to the rich. Unity in letting prices go sky high. Unity in whittling away all the benefits of the New Deal. Was that really what they wanted? He asked the crowd. Some things are worth fighting for. We must fight isolationists and reactionaries, the profiteers and the privileged class. Our primary concern is for the little fellow. We think the big boys have always done very well taking care of themselves. It is the business of government to see that the little fellow gets a square deal. Ask Sam Rayburn how many of the big money boys helped when he was sweating blood to get electricity for farmers and the people in small towns. It was all language his audiences understood. He was truly, as Rayburn said, one of the folks, and they let him know how much they approved. At a reception later at Rayburn's white frame house west of town, hundreds of people waited in a long line across the front lawn. They came in droves and kept coming, remembered Margaret. When Truman's Secret Service detail, worried for his safety, refused to let him stand in the receiving line unless the names of all the guests were provided, Rayburn exploded. "I know every man, woman, and child here." They were all his friends, every one, Rayburn said. He would vouch for them personally. So while Truman stood at the door shaking hands and sipping now and then on a surreptitious bourbon and water, Rayburn called out each name. But then Rayburn exclaimed to the governor, "Shut the door, Buford, they're coming by twice." For the Republicans, money was never a problem. Talk of the big money behind Dewey was another sign supposedly of just how far out in front Dewey was, how certain his victory, on the theory that big money never followed a loser. But to find backing for Truman was nearly impossible. At small White House receptions for Democrats that spring and summer, Truman himself had to ask for financial help, something he detested, just to get his campaign underway. At one such gathering in the Red Room in early September, he had stood on a chair to say in effect that while he knew most people thought he was going to lose, he thought the President of the United States should have sufficient funds to take his case to the people, but that as things were, he could not do that. There was no money to buy radio time. One of the most important parts of his speech in Detroit on Labor Day had to be cut, he said, because of insufficient funds to stay on the air. Now there was not money enough to get the train out of Union Station. His plea reportedly produced over $100,000. When Truman asked Bernard Baruch to serve on the Finance Committee, Baruch refused, saying it was not his policy to play so partisan a role. An answer that infuriated Truman, who in a sharp reply wrote, "A great many honors have passed your way, and it seems when the going is rough it is a one-way street." Baruch, his pride hurt, spoke of the president as a rude, ignorant, uncouth man. Others, too, turned him down, until finally he named for financial chairman Lewis A. Johnson of Clarksburg, West Virginia, a former commander of the American Legion and Assistant Secretary of War who had headed the Finance Committee of the Democratic Party from 1936 to 1940. Johnson was a looming, bald-headed, headstrong corporation lawyer and millionaire who stood over 6 feet tall and weighed 250 pounds. A subject of controversy in the past, he would be again in time to come, to Truman's regret. But he took the job now when nobody else would, and he achieved amazing results, given the fact that no one other than Truman thought the ticket had the slightest chance. Averill Harriman and Will Clayton were among the larger contributors. Harriman gave $5,000, Clayton $9,000. Others included Stuart Symington, David Dubinsky of the International Ladies Garment Workers, Milton S. Kronheim Sr., who controlled the wholesale liquor business in Washington, Jacob Blaustein, president of the American Jewish Committee, William Hellas, a Louisiana oil man known as the Golden Greek, who had been Governor Earl Long's biggest moneybacker, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, and Pearl Mesta, the Washington hostess who came on board the Truman train at Gainesville, Texas, for the ride across Oklahoma, where her first husband had made a fortune in oil. Floyd B. Odlum, head of the Atlas Corporation, a Wall Street investment company, put in $3,000, then rounded up another $20,000 from his associates. But the largest contribution seems to have come from Truman's old Kansas City friend Tom Evans, the drugstore king, who, after giving $3,000 himself, raised some $100,000 more in the Middle West. As the train headed across Oklahoma, the weather remained ideal. Truman, in fine fettle, spent much of the time out on the back platform waving at people as he sped along. If he was worried about campaign funds or anything else, no one would have known it. During a stop at Ardmore, having expressed his admiration for the Palomino horse of a cowboy who met the train, Truman examined the animal's mouth and declared it was 6 years old. "Correct," exclaimed the delighted cowboy, and the story appeared across the country. Truman gets right dope from horse's mouth. The crowd at Ardmore was somewhere near 40,000, more even, it was said, than for Gene Autry. At remote stations where no stops were scheduled, people waited just to see the train go through. At Paul's Valley, Truman asked if it was true they grew taller corn than in Iowa, and 5,000 people happily roared yes. "Hello, Harry," came shouts from the throng at Norman. At Oklahoma City, 100,000 turned out. 20,000 were at the state fairgrounds for his speech. He had chosen Oklahoma as the time and place to answer Republican charges of communism in government, and he was strictly on the offensive. Such Republican tactics were only a smokescreen to hide their failure to deal with housing, price controls, education, real problems. His own loyalty program, he claimed, had proven the loyalty of 99.7% of all federal workers. It was not Republican talk that checked the communist tide, but programs like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and that was a plain and unanswerable fact. The government was not endangered by communist infiltration. Publicity-seeking, electioneering Republicans with their irresponsible charges were doing more to damage national security than to strengthen it. The speech was considered so important that for the first time the Democratic National Committee had dipped into its slim resources to pay for nationwide radio time. But by then the money had run out. There was not enough even to move the train out of the station. The crisis was resolved when Governor Roy J. Turner of Oklahoma and a businessman from Shawnee, W. Elmer Harbor, organized an emergency collection party on board the Ferdinand Magellan and raised enough contributions, a substantial sum, to keep the train rolling for another several weeks. But even so, remembered Charlie Ross, the campaign was never more than one jump ahead of the sheriff. The day following, Wednesday, September 29th, was one of the biggest of the campaign. At Eufaula, Oklahoma, Truman gave his 100th speech. Before the day ended, he spoke 16 times. There were crowds at Shawnee, Seminole, Wewoka, Muskogee, tremendous crowds at Tulsa. Crossing into Missouri, Truman told the throng at Neosho that he had already talked to 500,000 people that day, an understandable overstatement, given all he had seen. And so it went the rest of the journey through Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. At Mount Vernon, Illinois, leaving his train to travel by motorcade, he stumped the downstate mining country for 140 miles, through 5 counties that had not gone Democratic in 50 years. Mr. Truman, reported the New York Times, was the first chief executive to campaign in southern Illinois, and the people turned out by the thousands, breaking through police lines, swarming around and through the procession of cars and yelling a noisy greeting. With his headlong lambasting of Wall Street and the special interests, the constant hearkening to grim memories of the Depression, he sounded often as if he were running against Herbert Hoover. But at Carbondale, the 6th of 9 stops in southern Illinois, he talked as he had not until now of the post-war era, of the history he himself felt responsible for and proud of, knowing how many in his audience remembered how differently things had gone after the First War. A Democratic administration working with a Democratic Congress had seen to a swift reconversion in 1945, not only avoiding a post-war recession, but achieving a peak of more jobs, a higher civilization, and better standards of living than ever before. There is nothing like that in the history of the world after a great war. Bear that in mind. Not very much has been said about that, but we had no riots and no bloodshed. We didn't have people crying for jobs. We didn't have farmers marching on Washington. We didn't have returning soldiers marching on Washington because we took care of them in educational institutions and absorbing them back into the economy of the country without a debacle. We enacted the Employment Act of 1946, pledging all our resources and efforts to the maintenance of prosperity. We brought the United States to a position of unquestioned leadership in world affairs. Don't let anybody tell you anything different. A warm reception in Kentucky had been anticipated, if for no other reason than Alban Barkley's presence on the ticket. But the crowds there surpassed all predictions. Truman was never more human, reported the Louisville Courier-Journal. He got down to earth and talked the language of the people. At Shelbyville, where a banner stretched in front of a wood-framed depot said, "Welcome home President Truman and family, grandchildren of Shelby County," he talked of his grandfather who had been married there. At Lexington, heart of the bluegrass horse country, he reminded everyone that it didn't matter which horse was ahead or behind at any given moment in the race. It was the horse ahead at the finish that counted. To the several thousand gathered on the tracks at Moorhead, Kentucky, pressing as close as possible to the rear platform of his car, he left no doubt what he expected of them. "Now, whatever you do, go to the polls early on Election Day, and don't waste any time. Just take that ticket and vote the Democratic ticket straight down the line, and you will be helping your country and helping yourselves. You will not only be voting for me, but you will be voting for yourselves and your best interests. And I believe that is exactly what you are going to do." At Montgomery, West Virginia, the final stop at 10:45 that night, Truman was so stunned by the size of the turnout at such an hour that before beginning his remarks, he asked the photographers to turn their cameras around and take a picture of the people. That was the real news to show the country, he said. But what to make of the phenomenon of the Truman crowds? Most correspondents attributed it to ordinary curiosity. Truman had made his campaign a vaudeville act, said Time, so naturally people would come out to see the show. The American people had a high regard for the office of president, and so naturally wanted to see the man who occupied it, wrote Robert Donovan of the New York Herald-Tribune, who had been on the train from the beginning. Fletcher Nebel of the Cowles papers would remember in particular the stop at Shelbyville. The early morning haze was still hanging over the hills, and the sun wasn't up, but gathered around the railroad tracks as far as you could see in any direction was this incredible crowd of people. Men holding kids up on their shoulders so they could see, little boys climbing trees and roofs, old grandpappies and men in overalls. Of course, we experts in the press car talked about the crowd, and we finally decided it didn't mean a damn thing. Anybody will come out to see a man who is President of the United States just to say they've seen one in the flesh. But that doesn't mean they'd vote for Harry Truman. He was going to lose. We believed it because we wrote it every day. Some correspondents, Jonathan Daniels noted, had convinced themselves that Truman's crowds were not Truman followers at all, but people wishing to see a very nice man on his way to oblivion. To Walter Lippmann, who as usual was observing the world from his ivy-covered home in Washington, all such speculation was immaterial. Lippmann deplored the whole spectacle of a president chasing about the country, devoting himself to parades and handshaking, trying to talk his way to victory. To Lippmann, who was secretly offering Dewey advice on foreign policy and who shared Dewey's contempt for Harry Truman, this was no time for a president to be away from his duties, and this president had been gone 16 days. Unwittingly, wrote Lippmann, Truman had proven how little he mattered. He had only begun to fight, Truman told the crowd waiting to welcome him at Union Station in Washington, Sunday morning, October 2nd. He would be heading off again in another few days. Others, his wife, daughter, his press secretary, looked exhausted, but not the president. To his sister he wrote, "We made about 140 stops, and I spoke 147 times, shook hands with at least 30,000 people, and am in good condition to start out again." It would be the greatest campaign any president had ever made, he promised. "Win, lose, or draw, people will know where I stand." So much would be written and said about the Truman campaign of 1948, about the scrappy, give-'em-hell Harry style that evolved, the headlong vigor and determination of the folks he doomed to candidate, that other factors bearing on the outcome were often overlooked. Truman was and remained his own show, nor had any president ever worked harder at running for re-election. But other efforts behind the scenes were of considerable importance. Like all campaigns, his was a combination of many elements besides the candidate himself. Jack Redding, publicity director for the Democratic National Committee, would later write of the classic unities of politics, saying they were as vital to a campaign as were the unities of time, place, and action to a successful drama. When the unities fuse, the results achieved are far in excess of the sum of the parts. That Redding, Howard McGrath, and others worked as hard and effectively as they did was all the more remarkable, given that they too knew perfectly what the odds were against them. It was Redding, for example, who enlisted the services of the manager of a Polish-language newspaper in New York, Michael Czaplinski, who saw that all Truman press releases were translated into various foreign languages before being sent to foreign-language papers and radio stations around the country. Later this would seem an obvious idea, but no one else had done it until then, and as Redding recalled, acceptance of the material was immediate. Truman's stories were carried substantially as written, in Polish, German, Spanish, Italian, Russian, Swedish, and with 35 million people of foreign birth in America, or roughly 25% of the population, of whom 11 million were eligible to vote, this was no small break. McGrath appreciated particularly the political importance of foreign-born Americans. It was with their support that he had been elected governor 3 times in Rhode Island, and he understood how greatly the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, as well as Truman's policy on immigration, mattered to such groups, that for no other reason than his stand on foreign policy, Truman had an excellent chance of winning their support. It was arranged for the president to have his portrait painted by a beloved Polish artist, Tadej Stika, who, though an avowed Republican, became an immediate convert after hearing Truman speak to a group of Polish editors about the problems of the world as they affected Poland. "Another hell of a day. I'm sitting for an old Polish painter, and I don't like to pose, but it's also part of the trial of being president," Truman had written in his diary on September 14th. "He's painted a nice stuffed shirt picture." In October, after Stika presented the portrait at a formal ceremony at the White House, all 72 Polish papers in the country ran a picture of the painting, as well as Stika's personal praise for the president. To publicist Redding, it was a political triumph. Meantime, for the amusement of the press, a selection of the platitudes and banalities of the Dewey speeches was prepared and distributed. "Our streams abound with fish. The miners in our country are vital to our welfare. Everybody that rides in a car or bus uses gasoline and oil. Ours is a magnificent land, every part of it." A 16-page, four-color comic book biography was produced, The Story of Harry Truman, which, panel by panel, portrayed the Independence boyhood, the courtship of Bess Wallace, Truman's time on the farm, and how the neighbors judged him. By crackies, in spite of Harry Truman's newfangled ideas about farmin', he's a derned good un. His part in the war took up 2.5 pages, followed by his business failure. You'd think the Republican administration would do something to help small businessmen. And the high points of his public service, including the presidency. To many, the comic book format seemed highly unfitting for a president. Several at the White House complained that it should never have been permitted without Truman's knowledge. But he had known and approved, and the book was a success. 3 million copies quickly disappeared. In some places, schools permitted distribution among students, who took the books home. Time, in a special feature, hailed it as something new in campaign literature, while regretting that it made no mention of the late great-bellied Tom Pendergast. Even more important and effective was a 10-minute Truman film, a short to be shown in movie theaters. With approximately 20,000 theaters in the country, the weekly movie audience in 1948 was about 65 million. Hearing that a Dewey film was being produced and paid for by the Republicans, Jack Redding, with no money available for films, threatened to have theaters picketed as unfair unless a balancing Truman story were made available. In response, the movie industry decided to produce a Truman film for nothing. Universal newsreels lost the flip of a coin and did the work. With so little time left and to keep costs to a minimum, the Truman story was put together almost entirely from available newsreel footage, with the result that the finished product had a feeling of authenticity missing in the Dewey film, most of which had been staged. The candidate was seen as Neighbor Truman, shaking hands with people on the streets of Independence, including a black man in bib overalls. He was shown visiting Eddie Jacobson in his store, at Grandview with his mother, but above all as the president, signing the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, addressing Congress, reviewing troops, conferring with Secretary Marshall beside the large globe in the Oval Office. The two-reel film that had cost the Truman campaign nothing and was considered much more effective than its counterpart on Dewey would, in the final week before the election, play in theaters in every part of the country. Thus, during the last 6 days of the campaign, no one could go to the movies anywhere in the United States without seeing the story of the president, boasted Redding, who considered it the most important publicity break of the campaign. 71-year-old Alban Barkley, meantime, was crisscrossing the country in a chartered DC-3 called the Bluegrass. In contrast to his much younger Republican counterpart and rival, Earl Warren, who was touring by train, Barkley had initiated what he called history's first prop stop campaign. He flew 150,000 miles and delivered 250 speeches, mostly in small cities, farm towns, coal and railroad towns, labor halls, and small hotel dining rooms, his audiences sometimes numbering only in the hundreds. The press called him the poor man's candidate, and Barkley enjoyed himself hugely, telling stories, speaking extemporaneously at almost any length, and giving no sign of wanting anything for himself, only to help the president and any number of local Democratic candidates. His own best help, he liked to say, came from the Republicans. Dewey's speeches reminded him, Barkley said, of an old Tennessee politician known as Fiddlin' Bob Taylor, who in the era of the free silver issue ran for governor by playing a violin and using his magnificent speaking voice to say as little as possible about anything specific, until finally he was pressed to state where he stood on the money question. He paused dramatically, Barkley would say, savoring the story, and he said, "Here is where I stand. I am for a little more gold, a little more silver, a little more greenback, and a sprinkling of counterfeit. When a reporter in New Haven, Connecticut asked Barclay if he honestly thought the Democrats had a chance, Barclay replied, "Certainly. What do you think I'm running around for?" One idea hatched behind the scenes by two of the new speechwriters proved a major embarrassment. David Noyes and Albert Carr, who were partial to the dramatic phrase or gesture, it was they who contributed the pitchfork in the back line at Denver, had concluded that the president needed to announce a bold move to dramatize his desire for world peace, and soon. They proposed he send the Chief Justice, Fred Vinson, on a special mission to Moscow to see Stalin. That Vinson, as a member of the Supreme Court, had no connection with the diplomatic role of the executive branch, that Vinson knew nothing of the crisis in Berlin beyond what was in the papers, or had any experience in Soviet affairs or in dealing with Stalin, were apparently not considered serious drawbacks. Truman agreed to the scheme, a decision that suggested as nothing else would that for all his show of confidence, he knew perfectly how desperate his situation was and was therefore willing to try almost anything. Undoubtedly, too, he hoped that so daring and unorthodox an approach might just give Stalin the chance to open up, as he later wrote. He still thought Stalin could be reached, reasoned with, man to man. If we could only get Stalin to unburden himself to someone on our side he felt he could trust fully, I thought perhaps we could get somewhere. On his second day back at the White House, Sunday, October 3rd, without notifying George Marshall, who was at a United Nations General Assembly meeting in Paris trying to deal with the Berlin crisis, Truman called the Chief Justice to his office and asked him to make the trip. Vinson was astonished. Members of the court, he said, should confine themselves to their court duties, and especially in an election year. But then, dutifully, Vinson consented to go. The plan was for Truman to announce the mission on a special radio broadcast to the nation. Charlie Ross was instructed to arrange with the networks for a free non-political half-hour for a statement of major importance. The State Department was alerted to make the necessary clearances with Stalin. Truman would remember requesting also that every possible precaution be taken against premature leaks. The atmosphere at the White House was extremely uneasy. Nerves were on edge. Those of the staff who had been traveling with the president were still exhausted, while a number of those who had remained behind felt overworked and unappreciated. "There is much confusion and taut nerves," recorded the faithful diarist Eben Ayers, "due to the belief that the president is going to be defeated. There are a few optimists in the place. There are jealousies and undercurrents all through the staff." The proposed Vinson mission made tensions still worse. Clifford and Elsie argued vehemently against it, almost violently, Elsie remembered. But when Truman met with his advisers in the cabinet room on Tuesday, October 5th, the majority view was that only a dramatic, even desperate measure could save the campaign. Excusing himself from the meeting, Truman went to the map room to inform Marshall by teletype. But Marshall, appalled by the very idea of the Vinson scheme, vehemently objected, with the result that Truman immediately called the whole thing off. When he returned to the cabinet room to report his decision, several at the table, including Jonathan Daniels, addressed him in no uncertain terms, arguing that the mission was his last best chance. But Truman cut them off. "We won't do it," he said. To Daniels it was one of the most vivid moments of all he had witnessed in the White House. If ever there was a point when Truman seemed at his best, when he was more than large enough for the job, Daniels later wrote, it was then, and at a time when by all reports he seemed smaller than ever. He got up and went out of the glass-paned door to the terrace by the rose garden and walked alone, very much alone that day, back toward the White House itself. He was wrong, I thought, but he was strong, I knew. There were no dramatics about it. He never said he would rather be right than president. The next time I saw him he was laughing with the reporters, the politicians, and the police as he got back on that long train which everyone seemed too sure was taking him nowhere. He was gone just 3 days this time. A quick swing through eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and upstate New York had been decided on as an extra effort. The Vinson mission presumably was dead and buried, and no one the wiser. But there had been a leak. The radio networks, understandably, had insisted on knowing the nature of the non-political announcement before relinquishing a free half-hour in the middle of a presidential campaign. So Ross had told them in confidence. The story of the aborted peace mission broke wide open. Editorials accused Truman of attempted appeasement, of playing politics with foreign policy. His attempted action was shocking because it showed that he had no conception whatever of the difference between the President of the United States and a U.S. politician, wrote Time. The campaign that had never had a chance was said to have been dealt a fatal blow. Dewey publicly decided to let the president's action speak for itself. Off the record, he told reporters huffily, "If Harry Truman would just keep his hands off things for another few weeks, particularly if he will keep his hands off foreign policy, about which he knows considerably less than nothing." When Marshall flew in from Paris on Saturday, October 9th, and stepped from his plane looking ashen-faced, it was said he had come home to resign. In fact, though Marshall was in poor health, his relations with Truman were excellent. Indeed, Marshall assumed part of the blame for what had happened, apologizing to Truman for not having kept him better informed on the progress of negotiations in Paris. Truman was not worried about the fuss in the papers. He found it hard to believe that the American people would fault a president too harshly for wanting to achieve peace in the world. He had been encouraged also by his 3-day swing. At Albany, Dewey's own capital, 10,000 people had come down to the station in an early morning downpour to cheer and shout, "Give 'em hell, Harry." On Sunday, October 10th, he was back on board the train, still behind in the polls, still exuding confidence, and with just 3 weeks to go. 3. Were one to pick a single representative day of all the many days in Harry Truman's drive for the presidency in 1948, a day that in spirit and content could serve as a classic passage in his whistle-stop odyssey, probably it would be Monday, October 11th, when he barnstormed through central Ohio at the start of what was to prove a crucial swing into the Middle West. Like the larger campaign, the day began in an atmosphere of gloom. When Truman arrived in Cincinnati at 7 a.m., it was cold and raining. The streets from the railroad station to the Netherland Plaza Hotel, where he was to speak, were deserted. A reporter for the Des Moines Register, who had been traveling on board the Truman train for weeks, described him as looking that morning like a man who had received bad news but felt the show must go on. The morning was bleak, and the whole plan for the day seemed pointless. At stake were Ohio's 26 electoral votes, but Ohio, the Buckeye state, was as formidable a Republican stronghold as any of the 48 states, with a Republican governor, 19 Republican congressmen, as opposed to 4 Democrats, and 2 famous Republican senators, Taft and John Bricker, who had been Dewey's running mate in 1944. Moreover, Truman had decided to spend much of the day in rural Ohio, in places where in 1944 the vote had run as much as 70% for Dewey. It had been Bill Boyle who had urged Truman to campaign in Ohio, and whose political sagacity Truman had decided to bank on. Boyle, who was still in charge of Truman's itinerary, was directing things now from an office at Democratic headquarters in Washington. From Cincinnati, home of the Tafts in the southwest corner of the state, Truman would head north on the B&O Railroad to Hamilton and Dayton, then on to a string of little towns, Sidney, Lima, Ottawa, and Deschler, where the train would turn east on the main line of the B&O, to stop at Fostoria, Willard, Rittman, and finally that night at industrial Akron in the northeast corner. It was a trip of 350 miles. That Truman would even bother with towns like Ottawa or Willard struck many as a waste of time. But then to many observers the whole campaign was a waste of time. Dewey, who had carried Ohio against Roosevelt in 1944, was so sure of carrying it again he would not actively campaign there. At one point, while stopped in Ohio, Dewey did not trouble himself even to step out onto the rear platform, but sat in his compartment with the blind drawn. Told there was a crowd outside hoping to catch a glimpse of him, Dewey did not even bother to raise the blind. In 11 speeches at 11 stops in the span of a 15-hour day, Truman hammered away steadily and happily at his same favorite themes: the high cost of living, the need for adequate housing, the intransigence and short-sightedness of the 80th Congress, the evils of the Taft-Hartley Act, and his desire for peace. He sang the praises of Franklin Roosevelt, and in the speech at Akron, the major speech of the day, he embraced as he never quite had in so many words the entire philosophy of the New Deal as his own, vowing to build upon it an always better way of life. There were no startling claims or announcements. He just kept pressing the attack, mindful always of where he was and to whom he was speaking. He praised the people of Hamilton for their wartime production record, a subject he knew about, he said, from his years on the Truman Committee. "I grew up on a farm, and I always like to see good farming country," he said at rural Ottawa, then spent 10 minutes describing the gains and prosperity achieved by farmers in the Democratic years since 1932. At Lima, home of a locomotive factory, he shouted, "I've worn out 3 locomotives, and we'll use 3 more before we get through, so that will make it good for business here." "Well, I say thank God for the whistle-stops of our country. They are the backbone of the nation," he told the citizenry of Little Fostoria. Bess and Margaret appeared on cue from behind the blue curtain, and always to the delight of the crowd. "Would you like to meet the boss?" Truman asked at Lima, adding that most married men had bosses at home. "He's the president," wrote the editor of the Lima News, "and yet he's just an ordinary family man, proud of his wife and daughter. He has something in common with many who heard him." It was shortly after this that Bess told the candidate that if he called her the boss one more time, she would get off the train. After the dreary start at Cincinnati, the skies had literally cleared. The rain ended, the sun broke through. A crisp autumn wind was blowing, and with the maples beginning to turn gold and red, Ohio was a calendar picture for October in small-town rural America. From Hamilton on, the whole way, the crowds were big and responsive, and Truman's vitality returned, as if he had been given a powerful injection. The sight of 10,000 people spilling out in all directions at Hamilton produced what the Des Moines reporter called the most striking change in the Democratic candidate's demeanor I have witnessed in all our trips. Everyone was surprised by the size and mood of the crowds. Ohio's youthful, handsome former governor, Frank Lausch, who was running a lone wolf campaign for another try at the governorship, had come aboard at Cincinnati, not at all sure that being seen with Harry Truman was the best thing for his fortunes. But as he told Truman in dismay, he had never seen such throngs. At Dayton, where he and Truman rode in a motorcade, there were 50,000 lining the route. Lausch, who had planned to get off the train at Dayton, decided he would stay on board. No two of Truman's speeches were the same. Nearly all of what he said was spontaneous, his energy and enjoyment appearing to compound as the day went on. The more miles he covered, the more he talked of the common people, the American people, or you good people of Deschler, or Dayton, or Fostoria, or Willard. As before, he played on fear of hard times, the memory of lean years, knowing from experience what so many who turned out to see him had been through, knowing, for example, how, among farmers, recollection of the 1920s in no way resembled the cliché good-time picture of the Jazz Age. "If you don't want to go backward," he said at Ottawa, "if you don't want to slide downhill to bankruptcy and poverty the way you did in the Republican 12 years of rule back there in the 20s, you better get out early on Election Day and look after your own interests." He knew he had been through it. "Take stock of your prosperity now," he was saying. "Remember, it wasn't the Republicans who pulled the country back on its feet." His opponent, he said, talked all the time of unity because he didn't dare do anything else. He's afraid that if he says anything, he will give the whole show away. Meantime, the real leaders of the Republican Party in the do-nothing 80th Congress had been sent off into the bushes to hide until the campaign is over. The people had a right to know where the candidates stood. That was why he had come to their town. They were entitled to know what the issues were, entitled to take a look at their president and hear what he had to say and decide for themselves. That was the idea of democracy. The people decide. "They tell me that Seneca County is a Republican county," he said at Fostoria. "Well, that's all right with me. I want the Republicans of Seneca County to know what I think." His best trackside talk of the day was at Willard in Huron County, Ohio, at 4:55 in the afternoon. It was a perfect example of Truman the barnstormer at top form. A railroad town of plain, square-frame houses and a population of 4,000, Willard had been called Chicago Junction until 1917, when it was renamed for Daniel Willard, president of the B&O Railroad. There was a surgical gloves factory in town, a Rotary Club, a good high school football team, and a World War II honor roll at the corner of Myrtle Avenue and Pearl Street listing 876 names. Will Rogers was known to have had lunch once in the restaurant in the red brick Italianate railroad station. Truman's train stopped just east of the station, and Truman, looking west from the rear platform, the late afternoon sun full in his face, appeared still fresh and clean in a dark blue double-breasted suit and dark blue tie. Flags snapped in the wind. A crowd of several thousand pressed closer, cheering, waving to him, calling, "Hi, Harry!" As in so many other places, people who had brought small children held them on their shoulders, so they could say one day they had seen the president. The excitement in Willard had begun building long before the train appeared down the tracks. When Franklin Roosevelt's train stopped at Willard during the campaign of 1944, and thousands of people had gathered, Roosevelt never appeared. They saw only his dog, Fala. Truman was introduced by Harlow A. Stapp, the proprietor of a popular bar and grill in Willard and president of Huron County's Young Democratic Club, who, to Truman's delight, was wearing a campaign necktie with Truman's portrait on it. Truman began with a few customary words of appreciation for the warm welcome, which he followed with a note of local history, in this instance Daniel Willard, who, as Truman said, was still fondly remembered for his generosity to suffering families of the town during the Depression. Several key themes were then sounded: housing, inflation, the 80th Congress, and Truman did a little advanced drum beating for the main speech to come at Akron, which was to be carried by radio. A personal observation on the value of opinion polls was also added at Willard for the first time. The complete talk, all spontaneous, lasted 12 minutes. Characteristically, it was without flourishes. There were no quotations for effect, no big words. He used no jargon, no stock jokes, nothing cute. But the intent of his thought was always clear. He spoke in good, solid, complete sentences, as indeed he did the whole way along, through the entire campaign. From what he said, his audience never had any trouble knowing what he meant. I have had a most wonderful reception in Ohio today. It has been just like this all across the state of Ohio. We started in Cincinnati and came up the western border of the state, and now we are headed for Akron, and it seems as if everybody in the neighborhood and in every city has turned out because they are interested in what is taking place in the country today and in the world. It is good to be here in Willard this afternoon, even for a short stop. You people here in Willard have a great tradition, a tradition set by Dan Willard many years ago when he was president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. I think it is significant that the name of Dan Willard is loved and respected all over the country because he was the man who believed in the common people of the nation. He liked and respected the people who worked for him, and he recognized their right to join a union and bargain collectively. Now, Dan Willard did not sneer at the whistle stops of our country. He trusted people, and people trusted him. I think that is a good principle. It is a good way to run a railroad, and it is a good way to run a country. That is the way I have tried to run the country, but the Republican Congress would not cooperate, this 80th Congress. Now that is the way, with your help, we are going to run the country for the next 4 years. The Republican candidate and the Republican Congress do not trust the people. They just work along at their old problem of trying to fool the people into voting for the interests of the few. They try to do it without telling you what they think. I have been out among the people now for nearly a month. I believe you have got a right to know what I think, and I've been telling you what I think. Tonight in Akron, I am going to talk over the radio about the Republican Taft-Hartley law. I am really going to tear the mask off the Republican Congress and the Republican candidate. In Cincinnati this morning, at a splendid meeting, I talked about housing. I told the people there how your president had tried for 3 years to get a decent housing bill passed. At other places we stopped at in Ohio, I talked about prices. I told the people how your president had twice called Congress into special session in an effort to get something done about inflation that is picking your pockets. Since I have been in the White House, there has not been a moment of doubt about where I stood on issues which are of concern to the people of America today. I have always spoken out, and I have taken a stand on every issue as it has come up. I don't wait for any polls to tell me what to think. That is a statement some of the Republican candidates cannot make. You know, since I started this campaign, I have talked to over 3 million people in various communities. They have come down to the train, just as you did this afternoon, because they were interested in this election. They know that the peace of the nation and the peace of the world depend, to a large extent, on this election. They know that the continued prosperity of our nation depends upon this election, and they want to know where the candidates stand on the issues. And that is what I have been telling you as simply and as plainly as I know how. There is not a single solitary man or woman in the United States today who can't find out in 2 minutes where I stand on the important matters, like foreign policy, labor, agriculture, social security, housing, high prices, and all the other problems we as a nation have to face. But there is not a single solitary man or woman in the United States who has been able, within the last 2 months, to find out where the Republican candidate stands on these issues. I think he's going to get a shock on the 2nd of November. He is going to get the results of one big poll that counts. That is the voice of the American people speaking at the ballot box. And he is going to find out that the people have had enough of such fellows as the one from this district who's been helping the 80th Congress to turn the clock back. And I think you are going to elect Dwight Blackmore to Congress in his place. And I think you're going to elect Frank Lausch governor of Ohio. If you do that, you will be voting in your own interests, and when you vote in your own interests on the 2nd of November, you cannot do anything else but vote the straight Democratic ticket, and I won't be troubled with the housing problem. I will live in the White House 4 more years. Now that will be entirely to your interests. You will have a Congress who believes in the people, and you will have a president who has shown you right along that he believes in the welfare of the country as a whole, and not in the welfare of just a few at the top. Akron, heart of the rubber industry, a big labor town, solidly Democratic, had been expected to give the Democratic standard-bearer a good reception, however dismal his prospects. But the welcome at Akron was tumultuous, everything that Cincinnati failed to provide and more. People jammed the streets 3 and 4 deep, an estimated 60,000 in what was reported in the national press as the biggest political show in the city's history, everyone cheering wildly as Truman passed. The Akron Armory was packed. It was the perfect grand finale for the day, and Truman was radiant. "I have lived a long time, 64 years, and I have traveled a lot," he told the crowd. "But I have never seen such turnouts as I have seen all over this great country of ours. The Republicans have the propaganda and the money, but we have the people, and the people have the votes. That's why we're going to win." Reporters traveling with Truman agreed it had been one of, if not his best, day of the campaign. By conservative estimates, the day's crowds totaled 100,000 people, even before Akron. By 11 that night, he was back on the train and heading west again. At 8 a.m. the next morning at Richmond, Indiana, he was out on the rear platform, ready to start another day. It had been known for some while that Newsweek magazine was taking a poll of 50 highly regarded political writers to ask which candidate they thought would win the election. And since several of the 50 had been on the train with Truman during the course of the campaign, Marquis Childs, Robert Albright of the Washington Post, Bert Andrews of the New York Herald Tribune, there had been a good deal of speculation about the poll. It appeared in Newsweek in the issue dated October 11th, and on the morning of Tuesday, October 12th, 3 weeks before Election Day, at one of the first stops in Indiana, Clark Clifford slipped off the train to try to find a copy before anyone else. The woman at the station newsstand pointed to a bundle wrapped in brown paper, telling him to help himself. And there it was, remembered Clifford years afterward. Of the writers polled, not one thought Truman would win. The vote was unanimous, 50 for Dewey, 0 for Truman. "The landslide for Dewey will sweep the country," the magazine announced. Further, the Republicans would keep control in the Senate and increase their majority in the House. The election was as good as over. Returning to the train, Clifford hid the magazine under his coat. With the train about to leave, the only door still open was on the rear platform. So I walked in. President Truman was sitting there, and so I cheerily said, "Good morning, Mr. President." He said, "Good morning, Clark." And I said, "Another busy day ahead." "Yes," he said. So I walked off, and I got almost by him when he said, "What does it say?" And I said, "What's that, Mr. President?" He said, "What does it say?" And I said, "Now, what does what?" He said, "I saw you get off and go into the station. I think you probably went in there to see if they had a copy of Newsweek magazine." And he said, "I think it is possible that you may have it under your jacket there, the way you're holding your arm." Well, I said, "Yes, sir." So I handed it to him, and he turned the page and looked at it, and he said, "I know every one of these 50 fellows. There isn't one of them has enough sense to pound sand in a rat hole." Truman put the magazine aside and made no further mention of it. It just seemed to bounce right off of him, Clifford remembered. There were 3 stops in Indiana, 4 crossing Illinois, where farmers on tractors waved small flags or held up hand-lettered "Vote for Truman" signs. "I was with Truman in the central part of the state," wrote Paul Douglas, Democratic candidate for the Senate. "There was great applause, and there were constant shouts of 'Give him hell, Harry!' And he was at home with the crowd. He was simple, unaffected, and determined. We were proud of him." At Springfield, after dark, old-time campaign flares burned. The streets were filled with people. "No one could come to Springfield without thinking of Abraham Lincoln," Truman said in his speech. "I just wondered tonight, as I have wondered many times in the past, what Lincoln would say if he could see how far the Republican Party has departed from the fundamental principles in which he so deeply believed. Lincoln came from the plain people, and he always believed in them." He crossed into Wisconsin and Minnesota. At Duluth, where he rode in an open car with Hubert Humphrey, fully half the population, some 60,000 people, lined Superior Street for 2 miles, crowding so close in places that the car brushed their clothes. At St. Paul, an overflow crowd at Municipal Auditorium whistled, stamped, and shouted as he delivered one of the best fighting speeches of the campaign. Now I call on all liberals and progressives to stand up and be counted for democracy in this great battle. This is one fight you must get in, and get in with every ounce of strength you have. After November 2nd, it will be too late. The decision is right here and now. But we are bound to win, and we are going to win because we are right. I am here to tell you that in this fight, the people are with us." The crowd at St. Paul numbered 21,000, 15,000 inside the auditorium, another 6,000 outside. Dewey, in his appearance at St. Paul 2 days later, drew only 7,000. Heading east again, Truman said there were going to be a lot of surprised pollsters come November 2nd. Some of the Dewey people were beginning to worry. When Dewey asked his press secretary, Jim Hagerty, how he thought Truman was doing, Hagerty said, "I think he's doing pretty well." Dewey replied that he thought so too. When at Kansas City, Dewey met privately with Roy Roberts of the Star. He was told the farmers of the Middle West were defecting from the Republican ticket in droves, and that he had better do something about it quickly. Time was now describing Dewey's crowds as only mildly curious, his speeches as not electrifying. "Our man is in," reporters were assured by the Dewey staff. "He doesn't have to win votes, all he has to do is avoid losing them." Dewey himself told Taft that he had found over the years that when he got into controversies he lost votes, an observation Taft thought disgraceful. There was much that Dewey could have said in answer to Truman. The Do-Nothing 80th Congress was, after all, the Congress that had backed the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Truman's assault on the Taft-Hartley Act failed to note that a majority of his own party in the House had voted approval, and then to override his veto. The evil influence of Wall Street on the Republican Party, as described by Truman, might have been made to sound a bit hollow had it been pointed out that such important figures within his own official family as Harriman, Lovett, and Forrestal had all come to Washington from Wall Street. Truman's dismissal of Henry Wallace had been a fiasco. His handling of the railroad strike might well have been made a major issue. The only way to handle Truman, Taft wrote later, was to hit every time he opened his mouth. But Taft was a cantankerous man, and Dewey was determined to stick to his own strategy. Meantime, a slight misadventure at a town called Boku in Illinois had raised a stir. Just as Dewey was about to speak at Boku, his train had suddenly lurched a few feet backward toward the crowd. There were screams. People fell back in panic. "That's the first lunatic I've had for an engineer," Dewey blurted angrily into the microphone. "He probably ought to be shot at sunrise." The cold arrogance of the remark did Dewey great damage. The story appeared everywhere, and with it the observation of the engineer, the lunatic, who said, "I think as much of Dewey as I did before, and that's not very much." With only 2 weeks to go, a new Gallup poll showed Dewey's lead cut to 6 points. In the seclusion of the governor's mansion at Albany, Dewey ordered a showing of all the newsreels of the campaign, and what he saw left him greatly disturbed. He was losing ground steadily, he was told. But when his campaign manager, Herbert Brownell, put through calls to some 90 Republican committeemen and women around the country, all but one urged him to keep to the present strategy. Among professional gamblers, the betting odds against Truman on the average were 15-1. In some places, they were 30-1. Besides the gamblers' odds, the opinion polls, the forecasts by columnists, political reporters, political experts, Truman by now had the majority of editorial opinion weighed heavily against him. His frequent claim that 90% of the papers opposed his election was a campaign stretch of the truth. It was 65%, which in fact meant overwhelming press support for Dewey, and especially since it included virtually all the biggest, most influential papers in the country. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Star, the Kansas City Star, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Wall Street Journal all endorsed Dewey. The Detroit Free Press called Truman intellectually unqualified. The Chicago Tribune, though far from admiring the liberal Republican candidate, simply dismissed Truman as an incompetent. An editorial backing Truman, such as appeared in the Boston Post under the heading Captain Courageous, was a rare exception. Harry S. Truman, said the Boston paper, was as humbly honest, homespun, and doggedly determined to do what is best for America as Abraham Lincoln. In standing by his party and its inherent principle of the greatest good for the greatest number, he has emulated other great Americans: Jefferson, Jackson, Cleveland, Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Alfred E. Smith. Like them, in the words of the old song, he dared to be a Daniel, dared to stand alone, dared to hold a purpose firm, dared to make it known. By that token, he should win. America likes a fighter. More representative were such conclusions as drawn in the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Truman is the most complete fumbler and blunderer this nation has seen in high office in a long time. Even papers that expressed an open fondness for the president as a man chose not to support him. However much affection we may feel for Mr. Truman and whatever sympathy we may have for him in his struggles with his difficulties, said a front-page editorial in the Baltimore Sun, to vote him into the presidency on November 2nd would be a tragedy for the country and for the world. For Charlie Ross, Clark Clifford, George Elsey, for everyone riding the Truman train, the campaign had become an unimaginable ordeal, interminable, exhausting in a way comparable to nothing in their experience. "If you're winning, you'd be surprised how you can withstand fatigue," Clifford would say later. "If you're losing, it becomes oppressive. They were long, long days. I was young and strong and in perfect health. From time to time, I wasn't sure I was going to make it." The candidate who bore the main brunt seemed indefatigable, his outlook entirely positive. Between speeches, he could lie down and go immediately to sleep, however pressed others were, however rough the roadbed. "Give me 20 minutes," he would say. Strain seemed to make him calmer and more firm, Jonathan Daniels recalled. At no point in the entire campaign did any of the staff or the press or his family ever see Truman show a sign of failing stamina or failing confidence. Once, during a lull en route to St. Paul after the stop at Duluth, Truman had asked George Elsey to write down the names of the 48 states, after which he gave Elsey the number of electoral votes for each and told him how they would go. By his count, he would win with 340 electoral votes. Dewey would have 108, Strom Thurmond 42, Henry Wallace none. He was not putting on a show for anybody, Elsey would recall. Obviously, he wasn't trying to influence or persuade or sell me. This is what the man himself believed. He either honestly believes he will win, or he is putting on the most magnificent and fighting front of optimism that any doubtful candidate ever did, wrote Bert Andrews of the New York Herald-Tribune. The Truman staff was another matter, Andrews noted. They all appeared a bit grim. The work went on from 7 in the morning until past midnight, day after day, until they lost all sense of time, until every day became merged with every other and everything became a blur. Margaret would remember the world beginning to seem like an endless railroad track. She would sit by the window and take idle snapshots of the passing countryside, telephone poles whizzing past, empty plains, country roads that seemed to lead nowhere. As Ross wrote, the president was driving himself unmercifully, and no one on the staff wished to do any less. Ross, the old philosopher, suffered from arthritis and heart trouble, yet worked 12, 14 hours a day, knowing how much Truman counted on him. For years afterward, Clifford said, I'd sometimes wake up at night in a cold perspiration thinking I was back on that terrible train. And day by day, steadily, the crowds grew larger. Clearly, something was happening. The mood of the crowds, their response to Truman, was changing. People seemed always to be happier after hearing him speak. I remember thinking, said Clifford, well, I don't know whether we're going to make it or not, but by God, I bet if we had another week, we would surely make it. There was something rolling. We could sense it, and the newspapermen could sense it. Robert C. Albright, the veteran political correspondent for the Washington Post, speculated, could we be wrong? We've got them on the run, and I think we'll win, Truman wrote to his sister from the White House on October 20th. After a day in Washington, he had flown to Miami, where 200,000 people filled the streets. From Miami, he flew north to Raleigh, where there were people all along the way from the airport, which is 15 miles out of town. Things were looking decidedly more hopeful on several fronts. In Berlin, with improved landing facilities and more efficient air traffic control after months of experience, the airlift was plainly succeeding at last, against all odds and forecasts. At his desk in the Oval Office on Friday, October 22nd, Truman authorized the dispatch to Berlin of still more of the giant C-54 transports, another 26 planes. The airlift will be continued until the blockade is lifted, General Clay declared triumphantly in Berlin. Winter supplies for the city were guaranteed. Back on his train again, Truman was telling a delighted crowd at Johnstown, Pennsylvania, that the GOP stood for grand old platitudes. And at a thunderous rally at Hunt Armory in Pittsburgh, he declared, I am an old campaigner and I enjoy it. His opponent, Truman said, acted like a doctor whose magic cure for everything was a soothing syrup called unity. And here were the American people going for the usual once every 4 years checkup. Say, you don't look so good, Truman said, acting the part of the doctor. Well, that seems strange to me too, Doc, he answered, as the voice of the people. I never felt stronger, never had more money, and never had a brighter future. What is wrong with me? I never discuss issues with the patient, but what you need is a major operation. Will it be serious, Doc? Not so very serious. It will just mean taking out the complete works and putting in a Republican administration." The audience roared with laughter. He had made the cool, letter-perfect Dewey a joke at last. Chicago went all out. Politicians who had taken part in the great Roosevelt rallies of 1936 and 1940 said they had never seen anything like it. Possibly as many as 50,000 people marched in the parade from the Blackstone to Chicago Stadium. Another 500,000 lined the route. Marching bands blared, fireworks burst overhead, yet oddly not everyone was cheering. Here and there, remembered Paul Douglas, there were people with tears in their eyes. The newspapers had convinced them that Truman was going to lose, and they believed that the gains they had made under the New Deal were going to be taken away. They seemed to feel something precious was about to be lost, and they wanted to come out and show their sympathy and support for the doughty little warrior who was doing battle for them against such great odds. Privately, Douglas felt that he, too, like Truman, would go down to defeat in his bid for the Senate. At the packed stadium to a crowd of 24,000, Truman delivered the most savage speech of the campaign, a wild attack, uncalled for, in which he said a vote for Dewey was a vote for fascism. The authors of the speech were again David Noyes and Albert Carr, whose main purpose, Noyes later said, was to provoke Dewey into fighting back, a strategy Truman accepted. An element of desperation comes into a campaign, Clifford would say in retrospect, and fatigue leads to it. Dewey was properly outraged, so much so he drafted a new speech for his own scheduled appearance at Chicago, but then was persuaded by his advisers to drop it, not to get into a slugging match with Truman. He mustn't get nasty, mustn't make mistakes with victory so close. Reportedly, Dewey's wife said that if she had to stay up all night to see him tear up what he had written, she would do it. "They have scattered reckless abuse along the entire right-of-way coast to coast," Dewey would say only in Chicago, speaking of Democrats in general. "And now, I am sorry to say, reached a new low in mudslinging. This is the kind of campaign I refuse to wage." Truman offered no explanations or apologies. He was on his way east, and the tide was rolling. Dewey's victory special would follow directly after him a day later. At Boston, 250,000 people banked Truman's parade route, cheered and yelled, and enjoyed the obvious enjoyment written all over the candidate's face. To the packed house at Mechanics Hall, Truman said Republican talk of unity was all a lot of hooey, and if that rhymes with anything, it is not my fault. On Thursday, October 28th, after 9 stops and 9 more speeches in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, the Truman campaign reached New York, where the outpouring of humanity and enthusiasm exceeded everything thus far. Had Truman's whole career gone uncelebrated until now, the roaring ticker-tape welcome that New York gave him would have made up for it. Over 1 million people turned out. Arriving at Grand Central Station in late afternoon, Truman set off on a 9-mile tour through the city, through the October twilight, led by a thundering motorcycle escort of 100 machines. Truman was perched on the top of the back seat of an open car. Bess and Margaret followed 6 cars back. The confetti, ticker tape, and shredded telephone book demonstration along 42nd Street was extraordinary, wrote Meyer Berger in the New York Times. It fell in great flurries, and much of it landed on the open cars. It curled and twisted from high windows. It fell in other places like driven snow. Through it all, the president's figure at times was only dimly seen. He was smiling, and he never stopped waving to curb crowds and to men and women clustered at high windows. As he rolled through 7th Avenue in the Garment District, loudspeakers, cranked to full volume, blared "Happy Days Are Here Again." He made 3 rousing outdoor speeches at Union Square, City Hall, and Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park on the Lower East Side, spoke at a dinner at the Waldorf Astoria, then again that night, his 5th speech of the day, at Madison Square Garden, where 2 of his old nemeses, Albert Whitney and Harold Ickes, joined him on stage while the band played "I'm Just Wild About Harry." A crowd of 16,000 roared its approval when Truman, evoking the memory of Al Smith, Robert Wagner, and Franklin Roosevelt, pledged his faith in the New Deal, pledged his support of Israel, and again, as at Pittsburgh, brought down the House with another doctor story. For weeks, he said, he had had the odd sensation that someone was following him. It had troubled him, so he asked the White House physician about it, but the White House physician had said not to worry. "There is one place where that fellow is not going to follow you, and that's into the White House." The race nearly over, Truman was determined to finish strong. Friday the 29th, under a clear blue sky, in what by now was being described as Truman weather, he covered 36 sunlit miles through the city. He was seen and cheered, police said, by 1,245,000 people. There was not a discordant note through the whole day. Tugs on the East River tooted a greeting. In the Bronx, crowds screamed, "Hi, Harry," and "Hi, Margaret." "You can throw the galloping poles right into the ash can," he told the delighted throng in Queens. If the campaign was only a ritual, as said so often, then it was a ritual people loved, and they loved him for embracing it with such zest. In Harlem, he made his only civil rights speech of the campaign. It was no impassioned personal declaration, but focused on the work of his Civil Rights Commission and its momentous report. Nonetheless, his appearance marked the first time a major party candidate for president had stumped in Harlem, and after reminding his almost entirely black audience that he had already issued 2 executive orders to establish equal opportunity in the armed services and federal employment, he vowed to keep working for equal rights and equal opportunity with every ounce of strength and determination I have. The cheering in Harlem was the loudest of all. When he rose to speak at the Brooklyn Academy of Music that evening, the audience gave him a 12-minute ovation. For months, efforts had been made to persuade Eleanor Roosevelt to say something, anything, to help Truman, efforts that Truman himself refused to have any part in, but all to no avail. From Paris, where she was attending the United Nations session, she wrote to Frances Perkins that she had not endorsed Truman because he was such a weak and vacillating person and made such poor appointments. Now, at the last minute, she changed her mind, hoping to help the Democrats to carry New York. There has never been a campaign where a man has shown more personal courage and confidence in the people of the United States, she said in a broadcast from Paris. The scene of the final rally of the campaign and the last platform appearance Harry Truman would ever make as a candidate for public office was the immense Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis, where there was not an empty seat. Discarding the speech efforts of his staff, he went on the attack, lashing out one last time at the Republican Congress, the Republican press, the Republican old dealers, and the Republican candidate. The stomping, cheering crowd urged him on. He felt afterward that he had done well. In any case, he had done the best he knew how. The odyssey was over. Sunday, October 31st, Halloween, was spent at home at 219 North Delaware Street. Home, remembered Margaret. I couldn't believe it. Truman worked on an election eve radio address to be delivered from the living room the following night. From the bottom of my heart, I thank the people of the United States for their cordiality to me and their interest in the affairs of this great nation and of the world. I trust the people because when they know the facts, they do the right thing. Election day, up at 5, he took his usual morning walk, read the papers, and had breakfast. Then, trailed by a swarm of reporters and photographers, he, Bess, and Margaret went to Memorial Hall 3 blocks away on Maple Avenue and voted. A final Gallup poll showed that while he had cut Dewey's lead, Dewey nonetheless remained a substantial 5 points ahead, 49.5 to 44.5. The betting odds still ranged widely, though generally speaking Dewey was favored 4-1. The New York Times predicted a Dewey victory with 345 electoral votes. Government will remain big, active, and expensive under President Thomas E. Dewey, said the Wall Street Journal. Time and Newsweek saw a Dewey sweep. The new issue of Life carried a full-page photograph of Dewey, the next president, crossing San Francisco Bay by ferry boat. Alistair Cook, correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, titled his dispatch for November 1st, Harry S. Truman, A Study in Failure. Changing Times, the Kiplinger magazine, announced on its front cover in bold block type, What Dewey Will Do. Walter Lippmann wrote about the work Dewey had cut out for him in foreign policy. Drew Pearson, who thought Dewey had run one of the most astute and skillful campaigns in recent years, surveyed the Dewey team, the exciting, hard-working, close-knit clique that would be moving into the White House. Marquis Childs questioned whether the Democratic Party could ever be put back together again, while in their final column before Election Day, the Alsop brothers worried over how the government could get through the next 10 weeks with a lame duck president. Events will not wait patiently until Thomas E. Dewey officially replaces Harry S. Truman. For Truman, there were but 2 irregular, entirely unprofessional samplings to take heart from. One was from Les Biffle, the Senate secretary, who, on his own, posing as a chicken peddler, had traveled about rural areas asking people how they felt about the election. Truman needn't worry, Biffle had reported. The common people were for him. The other was from the Staley Milling Company of Kansas City, which had taken a pullet poll among farmers who bought chicken feed in sacks labeled Democratic or Republican. The Democratic feed had pulled well ahead, but then the company decided there must be something wrong and so abandoned its polling efforts. Among the campaign staff, the state of physical and emotional exhaustion, the sense of relief that finally the ordeal was over, all but precluded any capacity for rational judgment of the outcome. Their devotion to the president was greater than ever, but that, of course, was another matter. Yet some now honestly thought he might just make it. In Washington, after a quiet day at the White House, Eben Ayers worked out his own remarkable assessment of the situation in the privacy of his diary. Were it not for all these predictions and the unanimity of the pollsters and experts, I would say the president has an excellent chance. All the signs that I see indicate it. The crowds which have turned out for him on his campaign trips have grown steadily. I cannot believe they came out of curiosity alone. Other conditions are favorable to the president, the general prosperity of the country. It is contrary to political precedent for the voters to kick out an administration in times of prosperity. The Dewey personality and campaign has not been one to attract voters. He is not liked. There is universal agreement on that. I have repeatedly asked individuals, newspapermen and others, if they could name one person who ever said he liked Dewey, and I have yet to find one who would say yes. The Dewey campaign speeches have dealt only with national unity, with the promise to do things better and more efficiently. He has not discussed issues clearly or met them head-on at any time. I have repeatedly asked my wife if it is possible that the American people will vote for a man whom nobody likes and who tells them nothing. Late in the afternoon of Election Day, Truman decided to disappear from the scene. It was an odd move and one never quite explained. The impression was he wanted to be alone, simply to get away from everyone and everything and be by himself. Only his immediate family and the Secret Service knew where he was going. The Secret Service was about to have a changing of the guard at 219 North Delaware. At 4:30, a Secret Service field car, a black four-door Ford carrying the night shift, pulled into the driveway behind the house. The day shift was ready to leave, to drive back to Kansas City, to presidential headquarters at the Mulebach Hotel. A crowd had gathered in front of the house. Truman went out the kitchen door and climbed into the back seat of the Ford with Agents Henry Nicholson and Gerard McCann on either side of him. Agent Frank Berry took the wheel, and Jim Rowley, head of the detail, got quickly into the front seat beside the driver. The car pulled away, drawing no attention. They drove to Excelsior Springs, the little resort town across the Missouri in Clay County, and checked into the Elms Hotel, the same place Truman had escaped to 16 years earlier, crushed by disappointment the night he learned he was not to be Tom Pendergast's choice for governor. The sprawling three-story stone and timber hotel was the latest of several that had occupied the site since mineral springs were discovered there in the 1880s. Its chief attractions were seclusion, peace, and quiet. Franklin Roosevelt, John D. Rockefeller, and Al Capone were all known to have escaped from public view at the Elms. On this November night, the place was nearly deserted. The rooms picked by the Secret Service were on the third-floor rear at the end of a long hall. Truman, who had left home without baggage, borrowed bathrobe and slippers from the hotel manager and went for a steam bath and a rub-down, after which at 6:30 he had a ham and cheese sandwich and a glass of buttermilk sent up to his room. As he ate, he switched on the bedside radio. The first final returns were from a town in New Hampshire called Hart's Location, where the vote, including 2 absentee ballots, was Truman 1, Dewey 11. By 8 o'clock Missouri time, Dewey was ahead in such key eastern states as New York and Pennsylvania, but Truman was leading in the popular vote overall nationally. About 9, Truman called Jim Rowley into the room. He was going to get some sleep, Truman said, but Rowley was to wake him if anything important happened. We all, of course, stayed awake, remembered Agent McCann. There was nothing to do but stay awake. The head of the Secret Service, James J. Maloney, was in New York, having decided Governor Dewey was certain to be the next president. Maloney and 5 of his men had taken up positions outside an upper-floor suite at the Roosevelt Hotel, where Dewey was relaxing with family and friends, waiting to go down to the packed Roosevelt ballroom to announce his victory. The crowd outside 219 North Delaware had grown larger, filling the sidewalks on both sides of the street and much of the front lawn. A stream of automobiles passed steadily by, their drivers slowing to see the excitement or to call to friends. Newspaper and radio correspondents had set up headquarters across the street on the porches of the Luff and the Noland houses. The night air was cool. Lights burned in every window of the Truman house, though the shades were all drawn except in the window of the upstairs hall, where a portrait of Franklin Roosevelt could be plainly seen. Reporters were counting on the president to make an appearance. "We waited and waited and waited," remembered Sue Gentry of the Examiner, for whom, like others who lived in the neighborhood, it was turning into one of the most exciting nights ever in Independence. For by 11 p.m., though several commentators and the Republican chairman, Brownell, were still predicting a Dewey victory, Truman, incredibly, was still ahead in the popular vote. The crowd on the lawn began singing, "For he's a jolly good fellow and hot time in the old town tonight." Then the porch light went on and Margaret came out. She stood on the porch smiling and making a hopeless gesture with both arms. "Dad isn't here," she announced. "I don't know where he is," she said, which wasn't true. The reporters were incredulous. "We couldn't believe it," remembered Sue Gentry. Some of the crowd began drifting away. The lights in the windows remained on all night, as they would remain on in houses all over town and all over the country. "What a night," Margaret wrote in her diary, conscious that she was at the center of history in the making. By midnight, Truman was ahead in the popular count by 1 million votes. "I haven't been to bed at all. I've been running up and down the stairs all night answering the phone, on the direct line telephone to the presidential suite at the Mulebach, to Bill Boyle, who gave me the returns. We are ahead, but at about 1:30 a.m. we hit a slump, then gradually came up again. Dad has slipped away to Excelsior Springs, and the reporters are going crazy trying to find him. They've offered me anything if I'll just tell them in which direction he went." Sometime near midnight, Truman awoke and switched on the radio, picking up NBC and the clipped, authoritative voice of political commentator H.V. Kaltenborn, the voice that had reported Munich in 1938 and that to much of America was the very sound of the news. Though the president was ahead by 1,200,000 votes, Kaltenborn said, he was still undoubtedly beaten. Truman switched him off, turned over, and went back to sleep. Through their vigil over the next several hours, Agents Rowley, Nicholson, McCann, and Berry also stayed tuned to NBC. "And all of a sudden," remembered Rowley, "about 4 a.m. comes this thing that the tide has changed. And so I figured, this is important. And so I went in and told him, 'We've won.' And he turns on the radio." Truman, Kaltenborn was saying, was ahead by 2 million votes, though Kaltenborn still did not see how Truman could possibly be elected, since in key states like Ohio and Illinois, the rural vote, the Dewey vote, had yet to be tallied. "We've got him beat," Truman said. Rowley was told to get the car ready. "We're going to Kansas City." 4. The black Ford pulled in front of the Mulebach a few minutes before 6 o'clock, just as it was getting light. The street was empty. At presidential headquarters, the penthouse on the 17th floor, Truman found only 4 who were up and about: Matt Connolly, Bill Boyle, and 2 Kansas City attorneys, Jerome Walsh and young Lyman Field, who had been barnstorming for Truman on his own all across Missouri, and who now, as the one nearest the door, had the honor of being the first to shake the president's hand and wish him congratulations. Charlie Ross, sprawled across one bed, appeared to be dead drunk, but he was only exhausted. It had been a rough night for all of them, but for Ross especially. The press had been furious with him for not saying where Truman was, and Ross finally had lost his temper, showing his first case of nerves since the campaign began. He didn't know where the president was, nor did Matt Connolly. None of them knew. The rooms were a shambles. "There wasn't a drop of liquor around, by the way," wrote Jerome Walsh later, trying to describe the scene. "It was all black coffee and cigarettes and 4 telephones jangling. At 6 we were out on our feet." Truman, though unshaven, appeared rested and bright-eyed, as refreshed as a man with 2 weeks' vacation behind him. Shedding his coat, he sat down on the couch and asked how things were going. Though Dewey had carried New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, Truman had won in Massachusetts, carried all the Old South but 4 states, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, which had gone to Thurmond, and was leading in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Colorado. He was ahead by slim margins in Illinois, Ohio, and so far, crucially, in California. In the popular count, he was ahead by nearly 2 million votes. Dewey had yet to concede. But what most impressed those in the room was Truman's perfect calm at such a moment. To Lyman Field, the president seemed wholly unconcerned. Here, by every sign, was a man on the verge of pulling off the biggest political upset in American history. He had confounded the experts, the professionals in both parties, not to say a nationwide chorus of columnists and poll-takers. The president, who had had to fight just to get the nomination from his own party, was beating the opponent everybody had said was unbeatable. It was not only a supreme moment of triumph in a long political life, but one of the greatest personal victories of any American politician ever. Yet here he sat as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. He just seemed the same old Harry Truman, Field would say 40 years later, the memory of that morning still a wonderment to him. Jerome Walsh was so moved by Truman's total composure that he decided to record the scene while everything was still fresh in his mind in a letter to a friend written just days later. He displayed neither tension nor elation. For instance, someone remarked bitterly that if it hadn't been for Wallace, New York and New Jersey would have gone Democratic by good majorities. But the president dismissed this with a wave of his hand. As far as Henry was concerned, he said, Henry wasn't a bad guy. He was doing what he thought was right, and he had every right in the world to pursue his course. Someone else pointed to a Kansas City Star headline which read, "Election in Doubt," or something like that. The president grinned. "Roy Roberts will change that in a few hours," he said. I did not hear the name Dewey mentioned by the president. I'm trying to give you a sense of the astonishment we all felt at the unbelievable coolness with which the president faced up to the whole situation, the manner in which he took the thing for granted, as if he had read the answer in a crystal ball 2 weeks before. At 6 a.m. there still was plenty of reason for Governor Dewey to refuse to concede. Conceivably, Ohio might have switched in late returns. California or Illinois might have toppled, and the president's lead been sharply reversed. Actually, Mr. Truman at 6 a.m. hardly seemed interested in the matter. To him, the election was won, had always been won since the day he began carrying his fight to the people, and his mind was already turning to other aspects of his program. The serenity of the president suggested to all of us, I think, that his years of crisis in office have equipped him with a very large reserve of inner strength and discipline to draw upon. Walsh, as he further wrote, could not help but think of Abraham Lincoln. "Is this sentimental outpouring?" he asked. "I don't think so." Charlie Ross would remember being awakened by somebody shaking him at 6:30. I looked up and there was the boss at my bedside, grinning. We all started talking at once. Truman put through a call to Bess and Margaret, both of whom burst into tears at the sound of his voice. He called in a barber, had a shave and a trim, then changed into a fresh white shirt, blue polka-dot tie, and double-breasted blue suit. By 8:30, Ohio went for Truman, putting him over the top with 270 electoral votes. A celebration broke out in the presidential suite. Vivian Truman, Ted Marks, Eddie Jacobson, Al Ridge, Tom Evans, and Fred Canfill arrived. The hall outside was jammed with exuberant well-wishers. At 9:30, Truman was declared the winner in Illinois and California. By now, too, it was clear the Democrats had won control of both houses of Congress. At 11:14 at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York, Dewey conceded the election. A wild cheer went up on the 17th floor of the Muehlbach, and as the doors to the suite were thrown open, more friends, politicians, and reporters pushed their way in. Thank you," Truman kept saying, shaking hands, and behind the thick glasses there were tears in his eyes. At Independence, minutes later, every bell, whistle, siren, and automobile horn seemed to go off at once. It had never occurred to anyone in town to plan a victory celebration, but now Mayor Roger Sherman quickly declared a holiday. Schools were let out, and at day's end, in a roaring, spontaneous outpouring of pride and goodwill, 40,000 people jammed the square to see and honor the victorious native son. Speaking from a small podium, visibly touched by what was the biggest crowd in the history of the town, with his courthouse behind him, Truman called it a celebration not for him, but for the country. 5. The country was flabbergasted. It was called a startling victory, astonishing, a major miracle. Truman, said Newsweek on its cover, was the miracle man. He had won against the greatest odds in the annals of presidential politics. Not one polling organization had been correct in its forecast. Not a single radio commentator or newspaper columnist or any of the hundreds of reporters who covered the campaign had called it right. Every expert had been proven wrong, and as was said, a great roar of laughter arose from the land. The people had made fools of those supposedly in the know. Of all amazing things, Harry Truman had turned out to be the only one who knew what he was talking about. Actress Tallulah Bankhead sent Truman a telegram. "The people have put you in your place." Harry Truman, said the radio comedian Fred Allen, was the first president to lose in a gallop and win in a walk. A few papers had predicted a close election. A Washington correspondent for the Pittsburgh Courier, a leading black paper, had also described how, in theory, Truman might win. John L. Clark of the Courier had traveled with the Truman train part of the time and had taken seriously the size of the crowds. Victory for the president in 23 states outside the South, plus a break in the South or an upset in California or New York, could spell victory for the president, Clark wrote, though he did not predict this would happen. Nor did the author Louis Bean, who, in a book published in July, How to Predict Elections, also offered the theoretical possibility of a Truman upset. As it was, Truman carried 28 states with a total of 303 electoral votes and defeated Dewey in the popular election by just over 2,100,000 votes. In the final tally, Truman polled 24,105,812, Dewey 21,970,065. Dewey, who had won in 16 states, had 189 electoral votes. Henry Wallace and Strom Thurmond each polled slightly more than 1,100,000 votes. Thurmond, with his victory in 4 southern states, had 39 electoral votes. Wallace, who failed to carry a single state, thus received no votes in the Electoral College. The outcome in the congressional races was 54 Senate seats for the Democrats, 42 for the Republicans. In the House, the Democratic victory was overwhelming, 263 seats to 171. Though Dewey had carried the 3 industrial giants of the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, as well as his own home state of Michigan, Truman had defeated him soundly in 13 of the country's biggest cities and captured the Republican stronghold of the rural Midwest, carrying Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, even Iowa, the very citadel of Republicanism. Truman held on to 7 states in the South, despite Strom Thurmond. He carried the 4 border states of West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and his own Missouri, where he won by more than 250,000 votes. In the West, where at the start only Arizona had looked safe for the Democrats, he took every state but Oregon. Truman also held Dewey to a smaller part of the total vote nationwide, 45.1%, than Dewey had in 1944 running against Roosevelt. As would be pointed out, Truman's margin of victory in such key states as Ohio, Illinois, and California had been narrow. He won Ohio by a bare 7,000 votes, Illinois by 33,000, California by 17,000. A switch in any 2 of these 3 states would have left him with less than a majority in the Electoral College and thrown the decision to the House of Representatives. Had Dewey won in all 3 states, then Dewey would have eked out victory in the electoral vote and thus won the presidency, while Truman finished in front in the popular tally. A cumulative shift of just 33,000 votes, apportioned to the 3 states, would have done it. But it was also true that a similar shift in other states would have made Truman an even bigger winner. Truman very nearly won in New York, for example, and unquestionably would have had it not been for Henry Wallace, who rolled up 500,000 votes in the state, which was half Wallace's national total. "I think the mistake was not giving more time to New York. We should have carried New York," Clark Clifford would say. Dewey won there by only 61,000 in his own state, and New York meant 47 electoral votes. Had there been no Henry Wallace or Strom Thurmond, Truman might well have gained another 85 electoral votes, giving him an Electoral College landslide. Efforts to explain why the impossible had happened began at once, as did, understandably, a great deal of soul-searching among reporters, editors, and broadcasters who had fallen down on the job so very conspicuously. To H. L. Mencken, who delighted in the outcome exactly because it shook the bones of all the smarties, the answer was simply in the contrast of the 2 contestants as they presented themselves to the voters. Neither candidate made a speech on the stump that will survive in the school books, but those of Truman at least had warmth in them, wrote Mencken in one of his last columns at the close of a long career of appraising the American political scene. While Dewey was intoning essays sounding like the worst bombast of university professors, Truman was down on the ground, clowning with the circumambient morons. He made votes every time he gave a show, but Dewey lost them. To Dewey himself, it had all turned on the farm vote. "The farm vote switched in the last 10 days, he claimed in a letter to Henry Luce, "and you can analyze figures from now to kingdom come, and all they will show is that we lost the farm vote." Joe Martin, who with the new Democratic majority in the House was to be Speaker no longer, said the fault was with the Republican Party, which had digressed too far from the people. Like many of the old guard, Martin and Taft both thought Dewey had run an abysmal campaign. "You've got to give the little man credit," said Arthur Vandenberg in a somewhat patronizing tribute to Truman. Taft, furious, said, "I don't care how the thing is explained. It defies all common sense to send that roughneck ward politician back to the White House." To the surprise of many, it would turn out that the Democrats had spent more on the campaign than the Republicans, the common impression to the contrary. $2,736,334 compared to $2,127,296, though many of the largest donations to the Democrats came pouring in after the fact, after November 2nd, some $700,000 in post-dated checks. A special study drawn up by the Republican Policy Committee would conclude, in essence, that the Republicans had only themselves to blame. They had muffed their best chance in 16 years to win the presidency and keep control of Congress. The fault was mainly with the Dewey strategy and the Dewey performance, his aloofness, speeches high above the voters' heads, the mistake of swallowing uncritically the Democratic propaganda. Dewey, said the report, had been drugged by the polls and thus sacrificed the initiative. Truman's hard-hitting assault on the 80th Congress, however unprincipled and demagogic, had been brilliant, since it had enabled him to divert the battle away from his own and his party's record. He succeeded in arousing public indignation. The Democratic sweep in Congress and its retention of the presidency is eloquent testimony to the brilliance of their strategy. As amply substantiated by a number of studies, the farm vote, the labor vote, the black vote, and the vote of the West had all counted heavily in Truman's success and in the Democratic sweep overall, just as the Roe Memorandum had forecast. Nor was there any question about the value of the kind of campaign Truman chose to run. His big effort in Texas, for example, gave him the largest majority in Texas of any state. The extra swing by automobile that he made in the traditionally Republican counties of downstate Illinois turned the tide there and was decisive in carrying Illinois. The campaign through rural Ohio on October 11th, the whistle-stop day that had seemed to others a wasted effort, apparently did make a difference. In counties that Dewey had carried in 1944, Truman was the winner. Ethnic minorities voted strongly for Truman. Catholic voters, too, it was found, had gone Democratic in large majorities. In some predominantly Catholic wards in Boston and Pittsburgh, the vote for Truman exceeded past tallies for Al Smith and FDR. In the noise and excitement of the presidential suite after Dewey conceded, Truman reportedly said, "Labor did it." But while several of the biggest unions in the country did work hard to get out the vote and supplied major financial backing for his campaign, John L. Lewis and Alvin Lee Johnston were in Dewey's camp, and to lose in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Michigan was hardly a sign that labor had carried the day. More important, as Dewey said, was the farm vote, and here, just as the Truman forces foresaw, the drop in the price of corn played a part. Once, in 1921, falling grain prices had bankrupted haberdasher Truman. Now they helped keep President Truman in the White House. Of the 8 largest corn-producing states, he carried all but 2. Black support for Truman had been overwhelming. He polled more than 2/3 of the black vote, a percentage higher than ever attained by Franklin Roosevelt. In such crucial states as Ohio and Illinois, it could be said that the black voter had been quite as decisive as anyone in bringing about a Truman victory. Speaking of Truman's civil rights program and its impact on the election, J. Howard McGrath called it both honest statesmanship and politically advantageous. It lost us 3 southern states, but it won us Ohio, Illinois, would have carried New York for us if it had not been for Henry Wallace, and it was a great factor in carrying California. The precarious state of the world also appeared to have benefited the Truman campaign, and particularly as it became clear that the Berlin airlift was a resounding success. Several of Truman's sharpest critics, Walter Lippmann among them, now also grudgingly concluded that even the inept Vinson affair had proved a political net gain for Truman after all. "The bear got us," said Dewey's staff man Elliott Bell, referring to the Russian menace. Also, clearly, a host of strong Democratic candidates were a major factor. In Illinois, most notably, Truman's slim but crucial margin of 31,000 votes stood in sharp contrast to the resounding triumphs of Paul Douglas in his Senate race and Adlai E. Stevenson, the Democratic candidate for governor. Douglas won by 400,000 votes, Stevenson by a still more astonishing 570,000 votes. Hubert Humphrey had won his Senate race in Minnesota. Estes Kefauver, who had campaigned in a coonskin cap, was the new senator-elect from Tennessee, another state in the Truman column. Democratic candidates for governor had won in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Frank Lausch had been elected governor in Ohio by a margin of more than 200,000 votes. Predictions of a Dewey landslide, it was widely believed, had lulled Republican voters into a state of false complacency. Had the polls not been so one-sided and unanimous, many argued, there would have been a bigger Republican effort, fewer Republican stay-at-homes on Election Day, and a Dewey victory. But a study of the campaign conducted by analyst Samuel Lubell for the Saturday Evening Post indicated quite the opposite. Republican victories in the industrial East, said Lubell, had been largely the fault of apathy among old Roosevelt voters who had concluded Truman didn't have a chance. Far from costing Dewey the election, the Democratic stay-at-homes may have saved him almost as crushing a defeat as Landon suffered in 1936. George Gallup, Elmo Roper, and other public opinion specialists were openly dumbfounded. He didn't know what happened, Gallup said. I couldn't have been more wrong. Why? I don't know, Roper admitted. From later studies, it appears the polls were reasonably accurate up until mid-October, the point when Gallup completed his final survey of the campaign for the forecast that was released just before Election Day. The fault was probably not that the polls were imperfect, but that they were 2 weeks out of date, and it was in those final 2 weeks, apparently, that a massive shift took place. Nearly everywhere in the country, it seems, a large number of people who agreed that Dewey was certain to win, and who no doubt would have bet on his winning, went to the polls and voted for Truman. In Ohio, up and down the state, reported William Lawrence of the New York Times, not a single Truman voter with whom he talked had expected Truman to win. But a majority of the little people from the mines, mills, and farms, having made their decision quietly and thoughtfully, went out and voted for him anyway. Two Ohio farmers, joking about the dissatisfaction of a neighbor who had voted for Dewey, were overheard saying, "What's the matter with that fellow anyway? Can't he stand 4 more years of prosperity?" "I kept reading about that Dewey fellow," said another man, "and the more I read, the more he reminded me of one of those slick ads trying to get money out of my pocket. Now Harry Truman, running around and yipping and falling all over his feet, I had the feeling he could understand the kind of fixes I get into." He had talked all summer of voting for Dewey, a farmer in Guthrie County, Iowa, told a reporter, "but when voting time came, I just couldn't do it. I remembered all the good things that have come to me under the Democrats." She voted for Truman, said Frida Combs of Decatur, Illinois, because he was the common man's man. To his immense readership in every part of the country, Walter Lippmann explained the outcome as a posthumous triumph for Franklin Roosevelt. The election, Lippmann said, was simply another victory for the New Deal. It was a view with which Truman modestly concurred. "It seemed to have been a terrific political upset when you read the papers here in this country," Truman would write in response to a letter of congratulations from Winston Churchill. "Really, it was not. It was merely a continuation of the policies which had been in effect for the last 16 years and the policies that the people wanted." But to Edward Folliard of the Washington Post, as to most others who had witnessed the campaign firsthand, what it had all come down to was Harry Truman's own gallant battle, his faith in himself and in the voters. As a barnstormer, the president was surely the best of his time. "There was something in the American character that responded to a fighter," said the Washington Post on its editorial page. "The American people admire a man with courage even though they don't always agree with him," wrote Drew Pearson, who had been as blatantly mistaken in what he wrote prior to November 2nd as almost anyone in journalism. "You just have to take off your hat to a beaten man who refuses to stay licked," conceded the ultra-conservative New York Sun. Richard Strout in the New Republic would describe election night as an experience no political writer would ever forget. "There was personal humiliation for us as a prophet, but a glowing and wonderful sense that the American people couldn't be ticketed by polls, knew its own mind, and had picked the rather unlikely but courageous figure of Truman to carry on its banner." The feeling was widespread that so heavy a blow to the prestige of the polls could only be good for the country. As Eben Ayers wrote, "There has been a danger, it has seemed to me, that the polls would reach a point, if they continued to be right, where they could easily control the outcome of an election." Some of the most intense and interesting of all postmortems went on at the New York headquarters of Time Incorporated, where telegrams from readers poured in saying, "Ha, ha, ha." A burden of doubt had been cast over Time and life. The editors were deeply unhappy, said Editor-in-Chief Henry Luce in a confidential memorandum to his department heads. Luce blamed himself as much as anyone. "I personally paid less attention to this campaign than to any previous campaign in my lifetime," he admitted. Reporters and editors had been deluded not just by the polls, but by politicians in both parties. Everybody should have known better. Everybody should have taken his job more seriously, Luce said, and worked right to the end, like Harry Truman did. To Luce, the main cause for Dewey's defeat was Dewey. His personality was against him. The managing editor of Time, T.S. Matthews, took the position that there was nothing new about the press being wrong on elections. The press was often out of touch with the popular will. I think the press has been pretending to much more wisdom, or is it smartness, than it had any right to claim, and has been getting away with murder for some time, Matthews wrote to Luce. The plain fact now appears to be that, as far as politics is concerned at least, the press hasn't known what time of day it is for years. The great mistake now would be to see Truman as a political miracle worker. He was not a one-man miracle, that's too easy, but an unsuspected, overlooked, misreported national phenomenon. But to the managing editor of Life, Joseph J. Thorndike, Jr., the problem centered on bias. Of course, we did not intentionally mislead our readers, he wrote, but I do think that we ourselves were misled by our bias. Because of that bias, we did not exert ourselves enough to report the side we didn't believe in. We were too ready to accept the evidence of pictures like the empty auditorium at Omaha and to ignore the later crowds. We were too eager to report the Truman baubles and to pass over the things that were wrong about the Republican campaign, empty Dewey speeches, the bad Republican candidates, the dangers of Republican commitments to big business. I myself had many misgivings about these things, but thought that what the hell, the election was already decided. We could get after the Republicans later. Truman's victory, said Thorndike, was primarily a personal triumph. And this, as it turned out, was the conclusion of Time in its first issue after the election. He did it all himself, said the magazine in tribute to Truman the politician. He was the new champion in American politics, the absolute boss of a resurgent Democratic Party. Truman works a political miracle, ran the headline on the lead story in Life. Truman was now the durable hero in shining spectacles, one of the fightin'est men who ever went through a campaign. To such staunch Truman loyalists as Sam Rayburn and George Marshall, to the weary White House staff workers who had been with him all the way, there was never any question as to why Truman won. He had done it by being himself, never forgetting who he was, and by going to the people in his own fashion. Harry Truman deserved 90% of the credit, said Sam Rayburn. You have put over the greatest one-man fight in American history, wrote Marshall to Truman on November 4th. You did exactly what you told me and what nobody else believed possible. I think that Harry Truman grew too, wrote Charlie Ross, grew spiritually. Truman had campaigned so hard, said Ross, because he genuinely believed the essential welfare of the country was at stake. He wanted peace in the world, prosperity at home, and he wanted to make the Democratic Party truly the party of the people. Also, wrote Ross, there was a purely personal motive. He had been described as a little man, fumbling, inept, not measuring up to the president's job. He had a human desire to prove his detractors wrong. Like others, Clark Clifford thought Dewey's people had done a poor job. I think Dewey's whole campaign was a mistake. They were greedy and dumb and anxious to get back to power. But that was not the explanation for Truman's success. Nor did Clifford think it was due to extraordinary political acumen on Truman's part. It wasn't, in my opinion, because he was a skilled politician that he won. He was a good politician, a sensible politician. But that wasn't why he was elected president. It was the remarkable courage in the man, his refusal to be discouraged, his willingness to go through the suffering of that campaign, the fatigue, the will to fight every step of the way, the will to win. It wasn't Harry Truman the politician who won. It was Harry Truman, the man. Early the morning of Thursday, November 4th, as Truman stepped out onto the rear platform of the Ferdinand Magellan during a brief stop in St. Louis, photographers snapped the picture that would be remembered and enjoyed more than any other of the campaign. Truman was smiling, chatting with reporters, when someone handed him a copy of the Chicago Tribune, his least favorite newspaper, across the front of which ran the huge, soon-to-be-famous headline, Dewey Defeats Truman. Holding the paper aloft with both hands, grinning from ear to ear, the man who had been given no better than a fighting chance seemed to be saying not only, don't believe everything you read in the papers, but that in America it is still the people who decide. Like some other photographs of other presidents, of Theodore Roosevelt in a white linen suit at the controls of a steam shovel in Panama, or Woodrow Wilson at Versailles, or Franklin Roosevelt chin-up singing an old hymn beside Winston Churchill on board the Prince of Wales in the dark summer of 1941. This of Harry Truman in 1948 would convey the spirit of both the man and the moment, as almost nothing else would. On Friday, November 5th, Truman returned to Washington in triumph. The welcome was the biggest, most enthusiastic outpouring for a president in the history of the capital. So great had been the excitement in the city the day before that the papers had forecast crowds of perhaps 500,000 people. But at least 750,000, two-thirds of the city, lined his route from Union Station to the White House. The day was warm, sunny, perfect. Truman, Bess, Margaret, Vice President-elect Barkley and his daughter, Mrs. Max Truitt, and Howard McGrath rode in a huge 7-passenger open Lincoln, with 2 Secret Service men standing on the rear bumper. Truman and Barkley sat up on the back of the rear seat. Passing the stone-fronted offices of the Washington Post, Truman looked up to see a big sign strung across the second floor. "Welcome home from Crow Eaters." The day after the election, the staff of the Post had sent a telegram asking him to attend a Crow banquet, to which all newspaper editorial writers, political reporters, pollsters, radio commentators, and columnists would be invited. The main course was to be Old Crow en glace. Truman alone would be served turkey. Dress for the guest of honor would be white tie, for the others sackcloth. In response, Truman had written that he had no desire to crow over anybody or to see anybody eat crow, figuratively or otherwise. We should all get together now and make a country in which everybody can eat turkey whenever he pleases. Confetti showered down. A band played "I'm Just Wild About Harry." Truman waved his hat and smiled. At the White House, he stepped to a microphone on the north portico to say thank you. The whole stretch of Pennsylvania Avenue, all of Lafayette Square, everywhere, as far as he could see, there were people, waving, cheering, calling out to him.